Dark Mage Rises, Mage Saga Book 2. Written and narrated by J.J. Green. Chapter 24. As Rhys checked the Dirksens' comm records, Carina was having grave misgivings. Why had she told him she was looking for her brothers and sisters? If she hadn't been groggy from the anaesthetic at the hospital, she doubted she would have taken the risk. On the other hand, without his help, she might never be able to locate Parthenia and the others. What chance did she really have of locating 4 children in an entire continent, or perhaps a whole planet? Rhys had arranged new clothes for her after she insisted on leaving the hospital. They still hadn't quite left, however. They were sitting in his Star Racer on the roof of the building, and he had been going through the recorded comms for ages. She had passed some time looking out over the city while the sun came up, and she had passed some more examining Rhys's vehicle. It was tiny, holding only 2 people, yet he'd assured her it was interplanetary. "Maybe this is a bad idea," she said, as she finally lost patience waiting for him. "If there was any mention of my siblings on those files, I'm sure you would have found it by now." "Not necessarily," Rhys replied. "These are personal files, and they aren't searchable. I have to go through them individually." "Personal files? You mean that Dirksens have access to other clan members' personal comms?" "Of course not." "Then how come you can read them?" "I figured out a way into the intra-clan comm system a few months ago. It was what I read there that partly fueled my decision to leave. Some of my family are depraved. It's sickening. Mother is about the best of all of them. Ah, wait, what's this?" His fingers swiped down the screen. "Huh, that's odd and interesting." "What?" She looked over his shoulder. "It's an audio file that was deleted only a few minutes after it was made. That could be anything, and it's gone now anyway. Not from my records, it hasn't. Let's see." He continued to work at the interface for a few moments. "Got it. I'll play it back." "But you said it was deleted." "When I discovered that deleting conversations and messages was somewhat of a habit in my clan, I set up a system to automatically copy all comms. It's the deleted files that are the juiciest. I only have room to store the information for a few weeks before I have to clear it out. But this comm was only made yesterday evening. Let's hear it." The first voice they heard was a young woman's. It was tremulous. "Father?" "Hello, Kiva. Where are you? Is everything all right?" "No, it isn't. I think I... "What's wrong? Are you still out hunting? We wondered what had happened to you. Come home now. It's late." "Father, I think I might have accidentally shot a child. I don't know what to do. Should I call for a medic?" "A child? Don't be ridiculous. How could you have done that? You must be mistaken." "I don't think I am. It was twilight, and I couldn't see very well, only their moving shapes. There were 4 of them. They were running away. I shot at them, thinking they were game. Oh, Father, I hit one of them. I know I did. Paul saw it too. One of them fell down." Carina's heart froze. "I'm telling you you're mistaken," the man said sternly. "What would children have been doing in our hunting grounds? No Dirksen child has been shot. I would have heard about it." "I don't think they were Dirksen children," the woman said. "I think..." "Then it doesn't matter, does it? Come home immediately, Kiva, and never mention this again." The comm ended. Carina's hand was over her mouth as she stared at the interface. Rhys said, "I'm sorry. That might be one of them, right? It makes sense. If they're from off-planet, they wouldn't know it's dangerous to enter woods unless they know who owns them. I seriously doubt any Australonian child would have been wandering through a Dirksen hunting forest." She struggled to reply. She could see visions of Darius lying dead on a forest floor. Do you know where the comm originated? Yes, Rees replied. I have the exact coordinates. It's a hunting lodge on the outskirts of the forest by the spaceport. Strap in and I'll take you there. Rees' Star Racer, as he called it, was a high-class spacecraft. She could barely feel or hear the engine as Rees started it, and the ship's motion was smooth as silk as they flew up and away from the hospital roof. She guessed the Star Racer's drive included the hover technology the Dirksens had brought to the planet. As soon as they were high above the city, Rees accelerated. The force pushed her back into her seat. How long will it take to get there? She asked. Not long, 10 or 15 minutes, he replied, checking the controls. This place is close by then? No, it's on the other side of the city, but up here we can fly direct, and the Star Racer is fast. She was twisting her hands in her lap, trying to ignore the image in her mind of Darius dying. So your relatives go hunting? It's a popular sport. They have forests all over the planet and hold competitions using ancient weaponry. He glanced at her. Sorry, do you go to them? These competitions? Rees shook his head. Not my kind of thing. Plus there's the fact that Mother is always there trying to partner me up with some girl or another. What? Other Dirksens? Do you marry your cousins? Only distant ones. Don't you? No, I don't think so anyway. In fact, she had no idea how mages met and married. Nine-Eye had never told her, and during the brief time she'd spent with Ma, the subject had never come up. She didn't know how her parents had gotten to know each other. That's another reason I want to leave the clan, Rees said. Mother's obsessed with making a good match for me, as she puts it. Like I shouldn't have any say in the matter. You're a bit young to be getting married. That's another objection of mine. Do we have far to go now? Perhaps they wouldn't find anything at the hunting lodge. Perhaps the woman, Kiva, had been mistaken. Or if she hadn't, perhaps the children weren't Carina's siblings. Nearly there. They continued the rest of the short journey in silence, Carina telling herself it probably wasn't one of her siblings who had been shot. Even if that had happened to any of them, they would have cast heel. The Star Racer slipped smoothly and quickly out of the sky. Its nose was tipped downward and the screen displayed a green expanse with a small clearing that was growing rapidly larger. At the centre of the clearing a wooden building stood. The bare ground surrounding the lodge was empty. Wait, she said. Is there any point in landing here? If that woman did shoot a child in the forest, she probably didn't do it right here. This is just where she was when she commed, and she won't be here now. She would have gone home like her father told her to. You're right, Rees replied. No one will be here at this time of day, but it's the only clear space for kilometres around. If your sisters and brothers are nearby, they might have headed here. He brought the Star Racer down on the lot outside the hunting lodge and opened the hatch. The air that flooded in was fresh, cool, and scented with tree oils. Carina climbed out and scanned the surrounding trees, but the space below their canopies was dark and silent. "Hey!" she yelled. "Is anyone there? Are you hurt? We can help you." No reply came. She didn't want to give away the names of her siblings. She had been hoping that if they heard her they would recognize her voice, but her brothers and sisters might not reply to someone yelling "Hey!" She cupped her hands around her mouth. "Parthenia!" she called. "Parthenia! Can you hear me?" Her voice echoed through the trees but received no answer. Rees strode to the edge of the clearing. "Parthenia!" he yelled. "Parthenia!" They waited in silence as the sun crept over the treetops and lit up the roof of the hunting lodge. They called again, but it soon became clear that if her siblings were in the forest, they weren't within earshot. "I don't know what to do," she said, her voice thick. She could tough out almost any situation, but the idea of one of her siblings lying injured somewhere was crippling her. "I'm not sure either," Rhys said. "We can fly across the forest to look for them, but the canopy makes it hard to see anything. Oh, wait, maybe there is a way." Chapter 25. "Yes!" Rhys exclaimed. "I do have a scanner." He was at the controls of his star racer. "I wasn't sure. I've never needed to use one." "Can it tell humans from other living things?" asked Carina. "This place must be full of animals." No, it can't. Good point. And it would take us forever to scan this place anyway. It must cover hundreds of square kilometers. It does. Rhys paused. "I'm sorry. I want to help. I feel responsible." "Well, you didn't shoot anyone, or did you?" "No, I've never even fired a weapon. I hate the idea of hunting, and Mother always insisted that I work in the business side of the family, not the military. But these people are still my clan, and I don't think you would be split up from your siblings if we hadn't captured you." "I can't deny that," Carina replied. "But I'm not giving up yet. I'm going to continue looking until I find them." She climbed out of the star racer into the lot once more. Her gaze searched the trees that brooded over the place. If I were lost in a forest, where would I go? Rhys joined her. "Have you had an idea?" "Just wondering how I might try to find my way out of here if I were on foot." "It would be hard if you didn't know the place well. As soon as you're in the trees, you can't see very far ahead, and all there is to follow are bridle paths and animal tracks." "What about streams?" Carina asked. "They might have followed a stream, thinking it could lead them to a river and people." "I don't recall any streams. Wait a minute and I'll check." She wondered how Rhys remembered being in the forest when he'd said he didn't like hunting. He returned from the star racer. No streams. The land's pretty dry around here." As they stood and thought, a shuttle passed overhead. She looked up. "Where's that going?" "How would I know? You seem to know a lot of things. What I mean is it heading to the spaceport?" "No, it's heading away from it." "So shuttles fly over the forest when they take off from the spaceport?" "Yes, some do. Why?" "Because if you were lost in a forest, a shuttle might be the only sign of civilization you could see." "Come on, I have an idea." "But that's about the only place I can't fly," Rhys protested. They were nearing the spaceport, and Carina had announced her idea of scanning along the forest edge. It was a long shot, but it was somewhere to begin their search. She would head in the same direction as a shuttle was flying if she were lost. Why not? I thought the Dirksens could do anything. She needed him to do as she wanted. It would take hours to search the area on foot. "Because it's incredibly dangerous," said Rhys. "I'd be flying right across the shuttle flight paths." "I think as long as you keep low, it shouldn't be a problem. The shuttles must have to clear the trees by a wide margin as a safety precaution. If you fly just above the canopy, nothing will even come close to colliding with us." "But then I might hit a tree instead." "Really? I didn't think you were that bad a pilot." "I'm not he exclaimed. "Huh, very clever. Okay, I'll try. But don't blame me if the military arrives to escort us away." "I'll take that chance." He turned the star racer and headed in the opposite direction to the flight of the shuttle they'd seen minutes earlier. She was hoping her siblings had travelled toward the spaceport and not away from it. The departing shuttles were flying in different directions, which would mean her sisters and brothers could be anywhere if they'd followed one. In truth, she didn't hold out much hope for her idea, but it was the best one she had. If her siblings weren't near the spaceport, they would just have to search every square metre of the forest. And she would ask Rhys to continue searching the news and comms for any sign of them. They would have to turn up somewhere. She only hoped that when they did, it wasn't because they'd revealed their abilities to the world. They were approaching a spaceport, and at the same time a shuttle was approaching them, rising at a steep angle. She turned on the Star Racer scanner, which registered heat from living bodies. She could already see the moving forms of animals beneath them, otherwise invisible beneath the canopy. But she couldn't see anything that appeared even vaguely human. Rhys tutted. "What's wrong?" In answer, he spoke a voice command. "On speaker." "Star Racer pilot," said a voice. "Your craft is not registered. Who are you? Please reverse your heading immediately." "Spaceport traffic control," Carina asked. "Yeah," said Rhys. "Speaker off." He slipped his headset off his head and let it rest on his shoulders. "They're gonna get real mad at me real soon. What can you see?" He glanced at the scanner display. Lots of animals, no people. "We're nearly at the spaceport. I'll start at the northern end and fly south." The Star Racer turned again as another shuttle passed overhead, closer this time. She was certain that if the shuttle's pilot had a warning klaxon, he would have blasted it. They reached the northern boundary of the forest, which was a highway that also ran along the edge of the spaceport. She peered even more closely at the scanner. "Go as slow as you can. We're so near to the ground I can barely register what I'm seeing before we're a long way past it." What she could see were the shadowy shapes of trees dotted with moving green forms of warm objects. Some were only sparks on the image, birds. Others were long four-legged animals with even longer tails. Other figures were more human-shaped, but they were moving rapidly through the trees in a non-human manner. They were about halfway down the line of the fence when she saw them, 3 green shapes quite close together. They didn't look very much like people, but they also didn't look like anything else she'd seen. "Wait, I might have something. Can you circle back?" "Are you sure it's worth it?" Rhys asked. "I don't think traffic control is going to tolerate me here much longer." "Just circle back," she snapped. Okay. She felt the Star Racer turn. When they'd arrived at the spot where she'd seen the strange forms on the scanner, Rhys hovered above it. 2 of the forms had changed position. They were moving, heading away from the third figure, which she now recognized as a person lying down. "Land here," she commanded. "I can't. There isn't room." "There has to be. This thing is tiny." "There's no space. The trees are growing right up to the fence." She cursed. She was sure the forms she could see were people. If they were her siblings, she didn't know why there were only 3 of them, but the story of one of them being shot tied in with the person lying on the ground. And if the 2 figures running away were her other siblings, it would make sense for them to leave at the approach of an unknown spacecraft. "Open the back hatch," she told Rhys. "What? While we're in flight? You're crazy." "Open the hatch and I'll jump into the canopy." "No, you'll kill yourself." "Let me find somewhere to land, then we'll walk back to this spot. There's probably a clearing nearby." "Just do what I say. Don't worry, I've done this loads of times before." She had never done it before, but she didn't want to waste time. They might never find their way to the spot or find the 2 children who were running. "If you're sure," Rhys said. He gave the command and the hatch opened. "Make sure you jump well away from the ship. The exhaust is hot." Now she could see the tree canopy below. She wasn't so sure about her plan anymore. So, before she had more time to think about it, she took 3 fast steps over to the open hatch and leapt out. A heartbeat later, she hit leaves and branches, breaking them and falling through until she collided with a thick branch which knocked the wind out of her. She wrapped her arms and legs around the branch, but the force of her fall carried her around it to the other side. She found herself clinging on upside down and struggling to breathe. Her ribs seared with pain every breath she took. She had broken at least 1 rib, and probably more as far as she could tell. But she was alive. She wriggled along the branch toward the trunk, each movement agony. By the time she reached her goal, she could breathe again. She tried to inhale deeply, but stopped and gasped at the feeling of knives piercing her lungs. She tried again. "Parthenia!" she yelled. "Oriana! Don't run! It's me!" She climbed onto the tree trunk and half scrambled, half fell down the tree, stopping only once to call out to her siblings again. She hit the forest floor, covered in bleeding gashes and her chest a mess of pain. "Parthenia!" she repeated, though she couldn't muster much volume. The forest was silent. Had she been wrong? Were the figures she'd seen not her siblings after all? Her eyes filled with tears. Then she heard the noise of something running, something human, and perhaps more than one of them. A little boy burst from the trees. Darius! "Carina!" he shouted joyfully. "I knew you'd come! I knew it!" He barreled into her, causing her to cry out in pain. Oriana was close behind him, but she wasn't so happy to see her. She looked distraught. "Do you have some elixir?" she blurted. "Please give it to me. Fern is dying." Chapter 26. Fern was lying on his back beneath a tree near the fence. He was deathly pale, and the forest floor all around him was stained reddish-brown. His eyes were closed. "I didn't want to do it," Oriana protested, almost hysterical. "I didn't want to do it, but when Parthenia didn't come back, he made me. He said it was the only way he could come with us. He said either pull it out or leave him here." Carina guessed her sister was referring to whatever it was Fern had been shot with. "So I did it," Oriana went on. "It was hard and I really hurt him. When I finally got it out, blood started pouring out of his leg. I couldn't stop it." Carina turned her unconscious brother over. The wound was on the back of his thigh and still seeping blood. She pushed the heel of her hand deep into it. Still Fern didn't stir. She guessed he didn't have long to live. If she had elixir, she might save him, but she'd drunk all of hers when she'd removed the tracers. They had to make some more, fast. But how? "You couldn't make elixir?" she asked. "What are you missing? What do you need?" "We only need fire," Darius replied. His recent joy at being reunited with her had entirely dissipated. "Did you look for firestones?" "What are they?" asked Oriana. "You don't know?" Ma clearly hadn't told them. Or rather, Stefan Scherer must have made sure she didn't. "Never mind. Oriana, come here and do what I'm doing. Press down as hard as you can. I have to look for a firestone." She removed her hand as soon as her sister was ready to take her place. She set off on her search. It wasn't likely there would be firestones or any other kinds of stone lying on the forest floor, but it was the only way she might save Fern. Darius was following her. "Go back to Oriana and Fern. Wait with them." "I want to stay with you. Please, Carina." "No, I'm sorry. You'll only slow me down." He turned and sloped back the way he'd come. She returned her attention to the forest floor. It was littered with dry leaves that overlay dark brown mould. The leaf mould had to be centuries old. It was moist and spongy. She was concentrating so intensely as she searched, she didn't notice Rees until he called. She looked up to see him some distance away. "Did you find them?" he shouted. She sprinted toward him, yelling, "Do you have anything that can start a fire?" "A fire? No, of course not. Why do you want to start a fire? Did you find your brothers and sisters?" She reached him. "I found them, but I have to make a fire. Don't you have anything at all? Please, think. Is there something on your star racer? Where did you land it?" "Sorry, I would help you if I could, but I don't have anything like that." She grabbed the front of his jacket with both hands. "Where's the star racer?" When Rhys turned to point, she set off immediately, not waiting to hear what he had to say. There had to be something inside the spacecraft she could use to make a spark and light some tinder. Perhaps she could short a circuit. As she neared the Star Racer, she found her problem had been solved. The forest was burning. The heat from the landing spacecraft had ignited the dry leaf litter. It wasn't a big fire yet, but it grew fiercer as she approached it. The flames were being blown toward her. She could see the rear of the vehicle through them. She grabbed a fallen branch and ran over to a patch of burning forest floor. The end of the dry tree limb soon kindled. On her way back to the children, carrying the torch over her head, she passed Rhys as he caught up to her. "I'd get your spacecraft out of there fast if I were you." She would have to get the children out of the forest quickly too, just as soon as she healed Fern. As the colour began to return to Fern's face, Carina put her head down and listened at her brother's chest. His heart was beating strongly. For a moment she couldn't move. Tears of relief welled up and spilled from her eyes onto him. She had healed him just in time. "Is he going to be all right?" Oriana asked anxiously. She couldn't speak. She nodded. Oriana threw herself over both of them. Carina gasped as the agony of her broken ribs tore through her. Hearing her sister's reaction, Oriana quickly moved off. "Are you hurt? I'm so sorry." Carina grimaced. She took a sip of the hot elixir and set about healing herself. As soon as she had finished, the acrid scent of smoke filled her nostrils. The forest fire was getting closer, but Fern remained unconscious. She would have to carry him. "We have to go," she said to Oriana and Darius. She grabbed Fern under his armpits and put him over her shoulder before slowly rising to her feet. But she was forgetting someone. "Where's Parthenia?" Oriana had said something about their sister not coming back. "She went to get help," said Darius. "But that was last night." A shadow settled over her as she wondered what had happened to her oldest sister. "Don't worry, we'll look for her. But we have to get out of the forest first. A fire is heading this way." Smoke was already making the sky hazy and wreathing between the trees. She was sure the air had grown warmer too. Carrying Fern, who was as limp as a rag doll, she led Oriana and Darius into the trees. She didn't get far before she realized she was walking toward the fire, not away from it. The ash in the air was growing thick, and she could hear the roar of flames. The conflagration had spread quickly. She doubled back toward the fence, thinking they could walk along it to reach the highway that lay to the north. As they walked, however, a tree a short distance in front of them began to smoulder. She cursed and turned. They would have to go the other way. But the smoke in the place they'd only just left was growing thick. Darius's hand slipped into hers and gripped it tightly. He looked up, his eyes wide and scared. Oriana coughed and brought her shirt up over her mouth and nose. It was no good. The only way to avoid the fire was to climb over the fence. Carina looked up to the top of it, which was twice her own height. She might make it there carrying Fern, but she didn't know how she would climb over and hold on to her brother at the same time. She might easily drop him, and a fall from that height could kill him. "We're going to have to climb our way out of this," she said. "But you two are great climbers, right?" "Yes," said Darius. "I'm a good climber." "You go first. Oriana, you climb under Darius, and both of you be careful when you're climbing down." "But what about the shuttles on the other side?" Oriana asked. "Won't it be dangerous out there on the landing ground? Won't we get arrested?" Neither of Oriana's points had escaped her attention, but she couldn't do anything about them right now. They would have to face those problems after they'd avoided becoming forest barbecue. Darius hadn't waited to be told twice. He was already halfway up the fence. "We'll figure that out later," she replied. "You go up now. I don't want Darius to be on his own." Oriana began climbing. The air was beginning to choke Carina, and she was coated in sweat. She adjusted Fern so he was sitting firmly pushed up against her neck. Grabbing the links of the fence, she started to climb. It wasn't easy, but she thought she could do it, though she still hadn't figured out how she would climb over the top. Darius was already over and heading down the other side. Oriana was nearly there too. When Carina reached the top, she paused. Her toes were pushed into the gaps in the wires, and one hand gripped the fence while the other held onto Fern's side to prevent him from slipping off. She needed 2 hands free to climb over, which would mean letting go of Fern. She continued to hesitate, not knowing what to do. Then Rhys arrived. His star racer was lowering out of the sky, a safe distance from Darius and Oriana, but at the edge of the spaceport's landing ground. He was really going to annoy air traffic control. By the time Carina was at the top of the fence, he landed, and the hatch opened. Oriana was looking scared. She didn't know who Rhys was. "It's okay," Carina called down. "He's a friend." "Wait there," Rhys shouted, running toward her. "I'll help." He worked his way up the links of the wire. "Can you pass him to me?" "Yes, but please be careful. Don't let go of him." "Of course I won't." With great care, she transferred Fern over to Rhys, who balanced the boy's limp form on his shoulder. As Rhys began to descend the fence, Carina climbed over, catching a glimpse of treetops on fire. She sped down the wires to catch up to Rhys and shadow him, ready to catch Fern if he started to fall. They reached the ground together, just as a tree bordering the fence burst into flames. Military vehicles were speeding toward them across the shuttle landing field. "Quick, everyone into the Star Racer!" Rhys shouted. "We can't all fit in that," Oriana said. "We're going to have to," said Carina. Rhys was already at his vehicle, still carrying Fern. She took Darius's hand. "Come on." They piled into the tiny space. Rhys had lain Fern on the passenger seat and taken the pilot's seat. "I'm closing the hatch," he said. "Breathe in." Carina, Oriana and Darius squeezed into whatever spare space they could find. The hatch of the Star Racer closed against Carina's back, pushing her down. The spacecraft lifted, and everyone was crushed together further by the acceleration force as Rhys flew away from the spaceport. 3 out of 4 of her mage siblings were safe, for now, but what had happened to Parthenia? Chapter 27. Parthenia had spent the night in the security room. The guards hadn't even given her a cot to sleep on, and so she'd been forced to curl up on the cold floor, napping fitfully over the long hours she'd been left alone. Aside from a couple of restroom visits, she hadn't been allowed out, and no one would tell her what was going to happen to her, or listen when she tried to tell them her brother needed help. She couldn't stop thinking about Fern, Oriana and Darius alone in the forest overnight. She'd told them she would be back, but she'd failed to keep her promise. They needed her, but she didn't know how to return to them. She was out of her mind with worry, to the extent that she barely considered how much danger she was in herself. The female guard had brought her breakfast, then left her alone, once again refusing to hear her pleas. Parthenia guessed something would happen to her soon. The guards had taken her into custody late the previous evening. Their boss had probably gone home by then, but now it was morning he or she would be back at work and ready to deal with the stray girl who had been annoying the passengers. Parthenia was mentally rehearsing her cover story when the door to the small room opened and the female guard came inside. Someone else entered behind her, an older man wearing a civilian suit, not a uniform. His hair was white with age, which was odd. Having your genes spliced so your hair never changed colour, no matter how old you grew, was a standard treatment. Even the servants at her family estate on Ithia had undergone the procedure. The older man also wore a small, neat moustache, another anomaly. Parthenia knew few men who hadn't arranged for the permanent removal of their facial hair not long after puberty, for convenience's sake. The man sat down and put a finger to his mouth as he regarded her. "Would you mind telling me your name?" "Penny Sharp." "And where are you from, Penny?" "I'm from Riverfield." Her next words fell out of her mouth in a rush. "I was travelling with my family, but we got lost. My brother's hurt and he needs help. I've told your guard many times, but she won't listen to me." The man turned to the guard. "Check her again. I want to be sure." The guard was carrying an ID scanner. She leaned over Parthenia. "Open up." She had been subjected to the same test twice before during the previous evening. She opened her lips. The result would be the same, and it meant she was in trouble. The guard put a probe into Parthenia's mouth and wiped it along the inside of her cheek. The machine bleeped. The guard turned the display screen toward the man. "Well, Penny Sharp," he said, "according to this, you don't exist. Now, ordinarily, I wouldn't be very surprised to come across an unregistered vagrant hanging around the spaceport. But you aren't a regular member of the invisible fringe, are you? There's no such place as Riverfield on all Ostilon, and the fact that you lied about your origins tells me you have something to hide. What is it? Are you working with smugglers?" "Am I working with smugglers?" Parthenia asked, her worries temporarily forgotten in her amazement at the man's question. "If I were a member of a smuggling gang, do you think I would go around drawing attention to myself by dressing like this and asking people for help?" Even the guard looked embarrassed by her superior's question. The older man coloured and coughed before muttering, "You could have been acting as a diversion. Anyway, what you were doing is irrelevant. As an unregistered individual, we have a duty to hand you over to the appropriate authorities. It's clear that you aren't Ostilonian. Therefore, I'm going to send you to the illegal migrant holding facility." He stood up. "Someone will be along to collect you soon." He went out. The female guard tutted. "If you'd been more polite and asked nicely, he might have let you go." She also left, and the lock clicked closed. Parthenia's head sunk into her arms. Why had she been rude to the spaceport official? Now she would never get back to Fern and the others. The illegal migrant holding facility was full to the brim. She was put in a cell with at least 10 other girls and women. They all stared at her when she arrived, and after the cell door was locked and the guard walked away, no one spoke to her. "Excuse me," she said to the person nearest to her, a girl about her own age who had bouncy blonde curls. "What happens here? Do we ever get to leave?" "There are a few ways out," the girl replied, looking Parthenia up and down. "Proving your identity, bribing the warden, or sleeping with the guards. Those are the main ones, anyway." At Parthenia's shocked expression, the girl laughed. "I was kidding for the last one." "Yeah," another woman chipped in. "You have to sleep with the guards just to eat. That's why Laurie's so fat," said a third. The golden-haired girl turned and glared at the speaker. Parthenia asked, "And what happens if you don't do any of those things?" "It's off to the asteroid mines with you," Laurie replied. "What? Forced labour? Can they do that?" Parthenia realized what a fool she sounded as the words left her mouth. Her own clan had done the same, if not worse. "If you don't exist," said Laurie, "they can do what they like." Parthenia's low mood sunk even further. How could she help her brothers and sisters if she was stuck on a mine somewhere? She might never see them again. What would become of them all by themselves? And what would happen to Fern if he didn't get medical help? She eased through the crowded cell, stepping over women who were sitting or lying on the floor until she reached the little window. It looked out onto a square yard where a few of the inmates were wandering aimlessly. Shuttles from the spaceport were crossing the small patch of sky. Parthenia felt like crying, but she didn't want to show her emotion in front of all these strange women. She rested her elbows on the ledge of the high window. Ever since escaping from the Shurers, everything had gone from bad to worse, and she had no idea how to turn things around. Fate seemed to be pushing her down a road that ended in nothing but loneliness and despair, and there wasn't anything she could do about it. Was she going to live out the rest of her life slaving away on an asteroid, never seeing her family again or finding out what had happened to them? The only saving grace in her situation was that things couldn't get any worse. As she aimlessly watched the sad figures of inmates meandering around the exercise yard, the murmur of voices in the cell behind her grew louder. She heard snatches of comments like, "Here he is again." Mildly curious about what the women were talking about, she turned around. A young man was moving down the corridor that linked the cells, accompanied by a guard. He looked so different from the last time she'd seen him, she almost didn't recognize him. When she did, she nearly froze. She had just enough presence of mind to turn away. Her back facing the visitor, her heart raced as she stared sightlessly out of the window, hoping beyond hope he would pass by without noticing her. But her brother wasn't so unobservant as to not recognize his sister, even from behind. "Parthenia," Castiel said, "how nice to see you again." Chapter 28. "Where are you taking us?" Carina asked Rees, her neck painfully scrunched up. Before he could answer, she also said, "Darius, could you scoot under Fern's seat? I can see some room there." Her little brother did as she'd asked him, shuffling along on his bottom to the space under the reclined passenger seat, where he fitted comfortably. "That's better," Oriana breathed, moving into the space Darius had occupied, which allowed Carina to change position and straighten up. "Back to the hospital, of course," Rees replied. "Your brother needs a medic." "No," Carina said. "He's fine." Rees gave her a quizzical look over his shoulder, but at that moment Fern stirred and his eyes opened. The first thing he saw was her. Before she had a chance to warn him, Fern blurted her name and tried to sit up. "I feel terrible," he said as he gave up his attempt and lay back down. "What happened?" He reached for his leg. "Did you—" "Fern!" Oriana hissed. "Shut up!" He finally noticed Rees. His lips clamped closed and he gave Carina an apologetic look. Rees said, "Were you the one who was shot? Are you hurt?" Fern began. "He wasn't shot," said Oriana. "Or he was nearly shot. He was just exhausted because we'd been walking through the forest for so long." It was a terrible excuse to explain Fern's unconsciousness, but Carina didn't blame her sister. She couldn't think of a credible explanation herself. And Oriana had thought it through. If Rees found out that Fern had been shot, he would want to know why he didn't have an injury, and that would require a whole lot more explaining. "Okay," Rees said. "I understand there are things you don't want me to know, Carina and family, but don't forget I helped to save your lives back there. You don't have to treat me like an enemy." "Rees," said Carina, "you're right. I'm sorry. Thank you for helping me find my sister and brothers. I couldn't have done it without you." Then she said, "Fern, if you're feeling better, can you raise your seat? We can hardly move in here." After some more shuffling around, the Star Racer was still cramped, but more comfortable. They couldn't stay in it forever, though. More to the point, they had to find Parthenia. "Rees, can you turn back to the spaceport? I think my other sister might be there. She left to go and get help, but she didn't come back." "Return to the spaceport?" Reese asked, incredulous. "I was lucky I didn't get arrested. If this spacecraft was registered, Mother would be pulling a lot of strings for me right now." "I thought Dirksens could do whatever they wanted," Carina said. "He's a Dirksen?" Oriana exclaimed, her voice laced with disgust. She tried to ease away from Reese's seat, but there was no room. "He says he's leaving his clan," said Carina. "I am leaving them," Reese said. "I would have thought what I did just now would prove that to you." "I do appreciate it, but we can manage by ourselves from here. So if you wouldn't mind landing and letting us out?" "You said you think your other sister might be at the spaceport?" Reese asked. "Let me see what I can find out." "You can check official comms as well as your clan's?" "Official comms are easier." Reese set the Star Racer to automatic flight and began to search again on his interface. This time he found the information within a few minutes. A young woman was detained at the spaceport on suspicion of smuggling. She was transferred to the illegal migrant holding facility around an hour ago. "That has to be her," Carina said. "Can we get her out? You can use your influence, can't you?" "Not so keen to get rid of me any longer?" Reese asked sarcastically. "I don't know. Maybe. Mother's comms have been building up for hours. She's going crazy, but I don't think she suspects what I plan to do yet. She probably thinks I'm rebelling a little, but I'll come home soon. So if we turn up at the facility, I'll still be a Dirksen to be feared, rather than one to be reported. I guess it's worth a try." "Thank you," said Carina. "I hope you'll accept I'm on your side if I manage to do this," Reese said as he input a new destination to the Star Racer's navigation. She sighed but didn't say anything. The problem was she and her siblings didn't belong to a side. She only wanted to gather them together so she could protect them and decide what they were going to do next. She didn't know what vision Reese had of his involvement with them once they'd found Parthenia, but she had no intention of having anything else to do with him. He already knew her name and was probably wondering about Fern's mysterious unconsciousness and how that fitted in with the comm that stated a child had been shot. It was far too much dangerous information. They landed outside a dark one-story building. Black, unmarked hover vehicles were parked outside, and the whole place exuded a depressive air. Carina hoped that if Parthenia had been taken here, they could get her out as soon as possible. A guard was leaning nonchalantly against the wall in the lobby when they went inside, but he quickly stood to attention when he spotted them. She wasn't sure if it was because he recognized Reese or because they were strangers. Reese walked up to a woman in uniform who was sitting behind a transparent screen. She glared at him. "Yes? I'm Reese Dirksen." The woman's expression softened, but not much. "Can I help you, sir? I'm looking for a young girl. She was brought in this morning from the spaceport. Do you have a name?" Reese looked over his shoulder at Carina, but she didn't know what to tell him. She doubted Parthenia would have told anyone her real name, especially her surname, but she didn't know what name she would have given. "Penny Sharp!" Oriana called out. The woman checked her list. She looked up, frowning. "We did have a Penny Sharp here this morning, but she was taken away." "What?" Carina said, stepping forward. "Where did she go? Who took her?" "Well, I'm surprised you don't know. She was checked out by a Dirksen." Chapter 29. Fern, Oriana and Darius waited outside Reese's Star Racer while he combed through the Dirksens' personal comms once more, this time trying to discover which of his relatives had removed Parthenia from the illegal migrant holding center. Carina sat next to him, watching over his shoulder in case he missed something. The back hatch of Reese's vehicle was up, allowing in the noises of the busy street. Hover vehicles hissed past, and every so often a large unmarked multi-passenger van stopped to unload or pick up detainees at the centre. Carina would glance at these scruffy, unkempt individuals just to check that, by some miracle, her sister hadn't been returned. She was clinging to the hope that whatever Dirksen had taken Parthenia hadn't known about the girl's powers, and that she'd been removed for some other reason. But Parthenia didn't appear, and though Rhys searched for hours, he couldn't find anything that alluded to Carina's sister. We do use people from the centre for various things, but there's nothing in the official record about someone being picked up today, and no mention of it in any personal comms. What do you think it means? Carina asked. Could the receptionist have been lying? Rhys shook his head. She wouldn't dare, even if she had a reason to lie, which she didn't as far as I know. It's very strange. Outside the Star Racer, Darius suddenly burst into tears. He wailed, his face pressed into his hands. Carina jumped out and went to him. "What's wrong?" she asked, putting an arm around his shoulders. "I'm hungry," he sobbed. "Oh, I'm so sorry," said Carina. Her concern about Parthenia had made her forget that her other siblings had spent the night and probably the previous day in the forest without anything to eat. And Fern had spent a lot of that time severely injured. She stuck her head inside Rhys's vehicle. "I have to buy some food. Do you know where I can go? Is there somewhere nearby?" Looking up from his interface, Rhys replied, "I can do better than that. You're all going to need somewhere to sleep as well as food and clothes and everything else. If you squeeze inside once more, I can take you somewhere." What's wrong? I don't know if that's a good idea. Maybe it's better that we part ways now. You need to continue with breaking away from your family. She didn't want Rhys to know where she and her siblings were staying, and she didn't want him to get to know them well. She might be able to hide her abilities from him, but she wasn't confident her sister or brothers could. "You're never going to get your other sister back without my help," Rhys said, his expression grave. "I can assure you, the fact that I can't find any mention of her probably means the security surrounding her is very high level. You'll never breach it alone. I can't force you to stick with me for a while longer, but you'd be stupid if you didn't." She hated it, but what he was saying was true. She called to Darius and the others to climb inside Rhys's tiny aircraft. The apartment he showed them wasn't much better than the one Carina had rented from the old man, but it was sparsely furnished. There were 2 bedrooms. "Great," said Fern. "One for boys and one for girls." "I'll sleep on the sofa, thanks," said Rhys. Carina stared at him. "You're planning on staying here too?" "Why not? It makes sense, doesn't it? That way I can help you more easily, and I don't have anywhere else to go." "Oh, okay." Rhys had paid their landlord from his own money, so Carina felt it would be ungrateful and churlish to refuse him, yet she remained deeply uncomfortable about the Dirksen man's proximity to her siblings. Fern had declared which room belonged to the boys, and he and Darius were already bouncing on the bed. Darius's ravenous hunger of less than an hour ago apparently entirely forgotten. "Come and eat," Carina called to them. She opened the bag of take-out food Rhys had bought on their way over and began to take off the lids. "Fern, check in the kitchen for bowls and cutlery," she said to her brother as he pulled out a chair at the rickety table. Darius didn't wait on niceties. He reached for a piece of meat poking out from a dish. "Wash your hands," she admonished. "Yes," Oriana said. "Come on, Darius." As Carina was laying the table, she could hear Oriana speaking in a hushed tone to Darius in the bathroom. "I know," the little boy exclaimed. Carina winced internally. Her sister had undoubtedly been reminding their brother not to allude to anything to do with casting while Rhys was around. There were only 4 seats at the table, so Rhys took his food to the sofa to eat. Carina sat down and waited while her brothers and sister filled their bowls. For the first time since she'd found them in the forest, she could stop what she was doing and simply appreciate the fact that most of her family were reunited. She resolved to do her damnedest to prevent them from being separated again. When everyone was eating, she also spooned some food into her bowl. The cereal was white grains, and the main dish was meat in a sauce. She ate a mouthful, but as she was chewing, she stopped and put down her spoon. "Don't you like it?" Fern asked, his mouth full. "I think it's great." Before he swallowed, he piled another spoonful of grains and sauce into his mouth. She had stopped because she had the same sense of déjà vu she'd experienced at Asher's apartment. The flavour of the food was familiar. The last time she'd eaten it, however, she'd been living with Nai. Like the noodle soup, the dish they were eating had been another of her grandmother's specialties. "It is good," she said. She continued to eat. If Rhys hadn't been present, she could have told Fern and the others about her discovery, but she hesitated to mention anything personal around a Dirksen, no matter how strongly he professed that he no longer wanted to be a part of his clan. After everyone had eaten, she insisted that the 3 children go and lie down. Though they were excited to be reunited with her and anxious to find Parthenia, they could hardly have slept the previous night. Also, though she didn't know what had happened after she'd transported them from the Shura shuttle, she doubted it was anything good. They would need time to recoup their energy. As she had predicted, Oriana, Fern and Darius quickly fell asleep. She closed the blinds in the bedrooms and went out into the lounge, where Rhys was searching for information on Parthenia once more. She sat down beside him. "Still nothing?" The young man's long, fine hair hung over his face as he leaned forward. He sighed, leaned back against the sofa, and brushed his hair out of his eyes. "There isn't a single reference I can see. Thanks. I do appreciate what you're doing for my family. Consider it my way of trying to put things right. When I think of all the things my clan have done over the years, and I'm probably not even aware of half of it. It was only a couple of years ago I began to realize what Mother and other Dirksens were doing was wrong. Up until then, I accepted that was how life was. I thought we deserved everything we had, and that if people didn't have anything, it was because they hadn't worked hard enough. The sheer evilness of what we were doing went over my head. Well, it's good you realized it finally. It's a shame the rest of your family haven't arrived at the same insight." "Yeah," he frowned. "You know, I've been putting something off that I really ought to do." "What's that?" "I should read Mother's comms. I won't reply. I want to make use of my status as long as I can to help you, so I'm not going to declare anything to her. But I have to face up to what I'm doing." He leaned forward again and lifted his screen. From her position, she could see he had tens, if not hundreds, of messages waiting from his mother. He began to open and scan them, spending no more than a few seconds on each. She could imagine what they said, variations on "Where are you?" and "When are you coming home?" But then Rhys opened a message that seemed to occupy a lot of his attention. He read it top to bottom, then his fingers flicked as he quickly opened the next message, and then the next. He let the interface fall to his lap. "Is everything okay?" she asked, wondering what Langley Dirksen had said to her son that could be so devastating. Rhys turned to her. "My mother has her. Your sister. I'd swear it." Chapter 30. The estate Castiel had brought Parthenia to reminded her of her home on Ithia, only it was far larger. The house was at least 3 times as big, and the ground stretched so far she couldn't see the boundaries. Castiel had wanted to walk in the grounds while they waited for someone. He hadn't said who. Nala trailed behind Parthenia and their brother. The little girl hadn't spoken since Parthenia had arrived. A man called Harmon walked even farther behind the group. He was large, with broad shoulders and a thick, muscly neck. Parthenia guessed he was there to prevent her from running away. Yet in fact his presence wasn't required. She wouldn't have dared to run from Castiel, not after he'd demonstrated that he could now cast. He'd used Nala as a subject for his demonstration. In a room inside the mansion, he had sipped elixir he must have made himself, and he'd cast transport on their sister. Parthenia had thought he would do something simple, like move her from one side of the room to the other, but instead he'd lifted her up to the ceiling. Poor Nala had hung there, plainly terrified but uncomplaining. It had been Parthenia who had begged Castiel to put their sister down, and safely, knowing he could release Nala and let her fall. In the end he had lowered the little girl rather than dropped her until she was a metre above the floor, when he did allow her to drop. He had smiled with satisfaction at the cry of pain she gave when she hit the floor. Later, as they walked across the lawn, he said, "I know how sentimental I must sound, but I'm glad to see you again, Parthenia." "Really," she replied, "I can't say I feel the same." "Oh, now that's unkind. Did you hear that, Nala? Parthenia doesn't like us. She isn't happy to be reunited with her own flesh and blood." "I don't know why you say us like that. I am pleased to see Nala, or maybe relieved is a better word. Relieved that you haven't seriously hurt her yet. Though that demonstration in the house just now tells me you're perfectly capable of it. Probably looking forward to it, in fact." His expression darkened. "If anything bad happens to Nala, it will be entirely justified, I'm sure." She made a noise of disgust. "You sound just like father." "I certainly hope so. He was a great man, and he was in the prime of his life when he was cut down by our evil bitch of a mother. With your help." He turned to face her, malevolence simmering in his eyes. His voice was soft, which made his words all the more terrifying. "And believe me, I haven't forgotten it." Full of bravado after the fact, aren't you? I don't recall you doing anything to help him at the time." He drew himself up and clenched his fists. Between his teeth he said, "That was because I wasn't sure I could cast at the time. Now I know I can. I won't allow anyone to do anything I don't want them to." His rage abated and he walked on. "Besides, I want to get away from our clan. We never received the respect we deserved from them. After everything we did, turning around their failing businesses, increasing their power and influence, we were still treated little better than slaves. They should have been bowing down to us, asking for our help and giving us rich rewards instead of locking us away and only bringing us out when they needed their performing monkeys." Parthenia inwardly smiled at his words. Once more he was using us incorrectly. He had personally done nothing whatsoever to help the Shurers, and he had enjoyed favour and numerous privileges that hadn't been allowed to his mage siblings. Also, it had been their father who had treated the mages like slaves, the very man Castiel had just been praising. From what she could understand, the other Shurers were either disinterested or uncaring about how Stefan Shurer used his children, providing the clan could benefit from her and the others' abilities. However, she was careful to show no sign of her wry amusement. She had already angered him once and gotten away with it, but she might not be so lucky again. It was a lesson she had learned well at the hands of their father. "There you are," said a voice. She turned to see a middle-aged woman standing at the mansion at a set of open double doors. She was richly dressed. Smiling warmly, the woman stepped out of the doorway and walked toward them over the neatly clipped grass. "I wondered where you had gone," the woman said as she drew nearer. "Castiel, Please introduce me to our guest." "Naturally." Smiling sardonically, he said, "I'd like you to meet my sister, Parthenia. Parthenia, this is our host, Langley Dirksen." "I am very pleased to meet you, Parthenia." She didn't reply. While she knew she would never get away with being rude to Castiel, she was willing to test the boundaries with this new person who was clearly colluding with him. As she saw her reaction, Langley Dirksen grimaced. "My, that look is familiar," she remarked to Castiel. "I can see the resemblance to her sister." "Yes, she does look a bit like Carina, doesn't she? Though Carina isn't a Shura like the rest of us. Parthenia and I only share a mother with her. We had different fathers." Parthenia wondered what else Castiel had told the Dirksen woman. She had a feeling it was probably everything, including all he knew about casting. He might even have exaggerated his explanation of mage powers. He had always been prone to boasting. She was also curious about what her brother was doing on a Dirksen estate and, more importantly, what he intended to do with her. It was unlikely to be anything pleasant. "So this is the one your father used to take to business meetings?" Langley asked. "Parthenia did do some of that, yes, though I also performed several key roles." Parthenia could hardly believe his last remark, which was utterly false. Before she could say anything, however, he flashed her a warning look. "And it was Carina who extracted your youngest brother from our custody." "That's right, though we didn't know anything about her at the time." Langley glanced at Parthenia. "Would you mind taking a stroll with me?" she asked Castiel. "Your sisters can wait here with Harmon." "By all means," Castiel said. The pair walked off across the lawn, away from the huge house. Turning to her large guard, Parthenia said, "Can we go inside? I want to sit down." Harmon considered for a moment before giving a short nod. She went through the double doors into a lounge. Nala traipsed along behind her. While both the girls sat on sumptuous sofas, Harmon stood with his back to the doorway, blocking most of the light. As they waited for Castiel and Langley to return, Parthenia wondered what the Dirksen woman's words had meant. She seemed to know Carina somehow, and she didn't particularly like her. Parthenia was certain the feeling had been mutual. On the one hand, she was relieved to hear her sister was alive and well, but on the other, she was dismayed to discover Carina had been captured by the Dirksens. She wondered how it had happened. Her sister was so smart and resourceful, she would never have fallen into Dirksen hands easily. Where was Carina now? Was she somewhere in the mansion, or had she managed to escape? Langley Dirksen's words hadn't made it clear. Parthenia resolved to find out and help her sister if she could. If Carina was being held captive, that explained why she hadn't come to find her mage siblings. She hadn't been able to cast locate using one of her bracelets. "My bracelets!" she gasped. The farmer called Marcia had taken them when she had found Parthenia and the others in the barn, and they'd forgotten to take them back before they fled into the forest. Now Oriana had no way of finding where she was, and she had none of her siblings' belongings to use to locate them either. They might never find each other again. Her throat tightened and her eyes filled with tears as she was reminded of poor wounded Fern and Oriana and Darius, who might still be waiting for her in the forest, though they'd probably realized by now she wasn't coming back. What would they do without her? Harmon stepped aside to allow Castiel to enter the lounge from the garden. Parthenia rubbed her eyes to rid them of tears, but Castiel noticed the gesture. "Are you upset, dear sister?" he asked. "Don't worry. You don't have anything to fear. Our lives are going to be so much better than the exploitation we suffered at the hands of the Shuras. Langley has made it clear how highly she values our skills, and she appreciates that we will truly commit to the Dirksen cause." "I think you mean your life with the Dirksens," Parthenia retorted. "You don't have any right to tell me what I can and can't do." "I may not have the right, but I have the means," Castiel said. He took out his bottle of elixir. "As long as I have this and you don't, I can do what I like." "As long as you have that and I don't, I'm useless to you. So that's an empty threat." Parthenia didn't go on, guessing she was skirting the limits of what he would tolerate from her. "You'll soon find out whether my threats are empty. What do you have that belongs to Carina? Hand it over. I'm going to find that." "I don't have anything." "Don't lie. She must have given you something before she transported you off the shuttle. She knew you would need something to locate her. Of course, she didn't give anything to Nala and me because she never wanted to see us again." He was close to the truth of what had actually happened, but she kept her lips sealed. It was clear from what he said that Carina was free, which was some consolation. Even if Parthenia had one of her sister's belongings, she would never willingly hand it over. She would never betray Carina. Castiel dropped into a seat and folded his arms over his chest. "It doesn't matter. She'll find out where you are eventually, and she'll try to rescue you. We can grab her then, and we'll get the rest of them." With a sinking heart, she realized he was correct. No matter how hard she tried to avoid helping him capture their older sister, she couldn't prevent herself from being bait. Chapter 31. Carina was uncomfortable with the idea of leaving Oriana, Fern and Darius alone while she went to rescue Parthenia, but she didn't have any choice. It was far too risky to take them with her. Rhys, however, would be coming along. Although she knew her sister was probably somewhere in Langley Dirksen's mansion, she didn't know exactly where. The place had to have 100 rooms. She needed Rhys to find out her sister's exact location and guide her there. Langley's comms to her son hadn't explicitly stated she was holding Parthenia captive. The implication of the woman's words was clear, however. She'd said things like, "Come home soon, darling. I have exciting news. It doesn't matter that the Shura girl left us. Someone else is here who possesses the same abilities." Carina could only conclude that, somehow, the Dirksen matriarch had discovered Parthenia's abilities. Perhaps the young girl had been observed casting, and Langley had wasted no time in removing her sister from the illegal migrant holding centre and taking her to the Dirksen estate. Rhys had never mentioned Carina's abilities, though he had to know his mother's reasons for holding her captive. And when he'd picked them up from the burning forest, he'd been curious about Fern's unconscious state, knowing that one of the children had supposedly been shot. Yet Rhys hadn't followed up with any questions about their powers. She guessed he didn't want to broach a sensitive subject. It followed that he hadn't mentioned anything when showing her his mother's comms. He let her draw the same conclusion from them as he had. "Are you sure you can get Parthenia?" Darius asked as she prepared to leave. "I'm going to try my hardest, but I can't promise anything. If I can't bring her back tonight, I won't stop trying until I can." "But you won't let them catch you, will you?" "Of course not." "Because I'd be really sad if I don't see you again." "I'd be sad about that too." She squatted down to look her youngest brother in his eyes. "You must do whatever Oriana and Fern tell you. No questions asked, okay?" "Okay." Darius looked down. "I just wish we could all be together again." "We will be, hopefully, after tonight." She kissed and hugged him and Oriana and Fern, then turned to Rhys. "I'm all set. Are you ready?" "I don't have anything to prepare. I'm waiting on you." She had prepared. While she had kept Rhys distracted in the living room, Fern and Oriana had made more elixir in the kitchen. She was bringing a full bottle with her. She was very reluctant to use it within Rhys's sight, but if she needed to cast while he was around in order to get Parthenia out, so be it. They left the apartment and went to his star racer. The plan was that he would land in his mother's estate grounds far from the house. She would exit the vehicle, then Rhys would continue on to the mansion, returning home as if he hadn't been missing for 2 days. After he'd endured his mother's predicted ire, he would discover where Parthenia was being held. Next he would meet Carina at one of the rear entrances to the home after everyone had retired for the night. According to Rhys, the final part of the plan entailed her, Parthenia, and himself then leaving his home together. But for her, this was the part where her own plan deviated. As soon as she was in sight of her sister, she would transport them both out of the house and far away. Though she appreciated what Rhys had done to help them, she didn't think she would ever feel safe with him around. Nine-Eye's lesson remained ingrained in her mind, despite her friend Bryce demonstrating that not everyone was out to use mages for their own ends. The metropolis was bright with artificial light, outshining the starlight. Rhys had input his mother's estate as the destination, and his star racer made its own way while he leaned back in his seat, resting the ankle of one leg on the knee of the other. He seemed unusually pensive. "I guess it's got to be hard for you to go home tonight," said Carina. "Yeah." Rhys picked at his nails. "I'm not looking forward to pretending I'm back for good, or that I don't have a problem with what my family does." He bit off a hangnail. "Or lying to Mother, if I'm honest. You know, she isn't really a bad person. Yeah, I know. You sound like you don't. Rhys, I know she's your mum, and it's hard for you to see her behaviour objectively. But just think about what her and the rest of your clan have done. You know a lot more about it than me. But I know Langley Dirksen kept me captive, and she tricked me into eating tracers that nearly killed me to remove. Are those the actions of a good person? But if you'd only agreed to what she was proposing, she wouldn't have done either of those things," Rhys said. "She really wanted to work with you, not against you, and she couldn't afford to let you go. What if you'd gone back to work for the Shurers? It would have been stupid of her to allow that to happen. The Shurers are evil. If they take control of the entire sector, everyone will suffer for it." She sat up in her seat. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. Did the kid really have no idea of the suffering of people on Ostalon, like Asher? "First of all," she said, "I thought you didn't want to be a Dirksen any longer. Why are you defending them? And secondly, I've seen what the Shurers and Dirksens do to the people they control, and they're equally bad. People on both sides try to justify their evil acts by saying they're necessary to achieve peace and prosperity. But that's all their arguments are, attempts at justification. I don't know who's worse, the people who don't care they're cruel, or the people who behave cruelly and pretend to themselves they have some kind of higher purpose." Rhys didn't answer. She went on, "Your mother might think she would treat me well if I agreed to do what she said, but it wouldn't last. As soon as I said no to something she wanted, she would try to force me to obey her. She would stop seeing me as a human being. I would become an impediment to her plans, and all her fine words would fly out of the window, as I soon found out after a day at your place. I really don't think you really have no idea what you're talking about," she snapped. She was tempted to tell him about all that had happened to Ma. That might convince him of the truth of what she was saying. But the last thing she wanted to do was give Rhys Dirksen any more information about herself or mages, especially considering that she hopefully wouldn't see him again after tonight. Instead, she said, If you start out a relationship in a bad way, like by coercing someone or lying to them, things won't ever change, they'll only get worse. You can't do something bad and tell yourself that in the future you'll behave better. It isn't going to happen. What you did at the start sets the pattern. So please don't try to assure me that the woman who kidnapped me and whose guard beat me up has my best interests at heart. It's insulting. A corner of his lips lifted. Well, that told me, I guess. They'd left the city and were flying over dark countryside. She could make out faint lights in the distance, which she assumed were shining from the windows of the Dirksen mansion. "Just another couple of minutes," said Rhys. "I'm going to set down just inside the estate walls. You'll have an hour's walk to the house. Is that okay? If that's the safest way to do it, that's absolutely fine. It will be a while before Mother goes to bed, so we have plenty of time. Only make sure to watch out for guards. They patrol the grounds sometimes, but not much. Dirksens don't expect to be attacked on a home planet, so the guards are only checking for vagrants and burglars. I am a kind of burglar, only I'll be stealing my own family's treasure." Chapter 32. The Dirksen mansion was silent as Carina approached it after her long walk. The dark windows were blank eyes. She wondered which window it was she'd looked out of during her captivity. A shudder ran through her as she recalled her time there. Her experience had been nothing like what Ma had endured for years, but she was in no doubt that, had she stayed, her life would have been similar eventually. She was armed with nothing except elixir. She hoped it would be all she needed to slip inside the place and transport herself and Parthenia out. Once her sister was free and her mage siblings were reunited, she could begin to think about how she would get everyone off planet. She hadn't forgotten about the Shura spy at Langley's party and what her presence probably meant. Several pairs of double doors ran along the first floor at the rear of the mansion. She was pleased to see that, as arranged, Rhys had left one of them slightly ajar. Her heart was thumping as she opened the door wider. She peeked through into a quiet, dark room. It seemed empty. She slipped inside. Rhys was waiting. He stepped out of the shadow of a corner and beckoned her. She tiptoed across the room, avoiding the large chaise longue that stood in her way. "She's in the suite you slept in," Rhys whispered as soon as she was close enough to hear him. So Langley was trying out her soft coercion on Parthenia too. It was better than throwing her in the cellar immediately. She hoped the Dirksen matriarch hadn't already fed her sister their tiny tracers. She followed Rhys out of the lounge into the downstairs corridor. "You should wait here," she said to him quietly. "I can remember where the suite is." As soon as she laid eyes on Parthenia, she would transport them both out of the place. She wanted Rhys out of the way so he wouldn't witness her casting. Also, Rhys would probably be more of a hindrance than a help if she had to deal with Harmon. He shook his head. "I want to help." It wasn't the time or place to argue about it. She went in front of him and walked softly down the corridor to the stairs. Her hand on her bottle of elixir, she began to climb the steps, placing each foot gently on the treads. Rhys was directly behind her. She listened intently, hoping to hear the sleep breathing of Harmon or another guard. Surprising an unconscious guard was the best break she could hope for. She heard nothing. As she approached the top of the stairs, she unscrewed the lid on the elixir bottle. She didn't want to cast in front of Rhys, but she also knew that if Harmon was on guard duty, she would never defeat him without some extra help. She sipped and swallowed a mouthful of elixir as her head rose above the level of the second floor. Harmon was standing, silent and bulky, in front of the suite door. Unlike the man who had been guarding her the night she escaped, he hadn't brought along a chair to nap the night away. She turned to Rhys and gestured to him with a flat hand. Wait. She closed her eyes and cast her first, but hopefully not her last, transport of the evening. She sent out the cast and opened her eyes. To her great satisfaction, Harmon flew upward. His head struck the ceiling with a crack, but before he fell down, the cast also caught him and dropped him quietly to the floor. He landed with barely a bump and lay sprawled out and motionless. Harmon was out cold, but she didn't know for how long. The man's skull was probably extremely thick. She ran lightly along the hall to the suite door, leaving Rhys to do whatever he wanted. She tried the door, but it was locked, of course. With plenty of elixir on her, that wasn't a problem. In a few moments, the unlocked cast had done its work. A quick glance at Harmon told her he remained dead to the world. She went inside the room. Her plan had nearly succeeded. Her heart lifted. The lounge of the suite was exactly as she remembered. It was empty, so Parthenia had to be in the bedroom, asleep. No problem. She could transport her sister without waking her up. Swallowing another mouthful of elixir, she opened the bedroom door. She was surprised to see the bed was empty. Had Rhys misunderstood and directed her to the wrong suite? A muffled whimper drew her attention. She swung around and nearly froze in shock. In a white nightgown, in a far corner of the bedroom, Parthenia stood. She was gagged. Even more of a surprise was the person standing beside her, Castiel. Carina reacted instinctively. Castiel's presence didn't matter. Now she could see Parthenia, she could transport her. She closed her eyes. With a great effort of concentration, she cast. Almost immediately, a shockwave hit her, knocking her from her feet. The wave was so intense, so reeking of evil, she was momentarily dazed. She was on the floor. Parthenia was staring at her, eyes wide and panicky above her gag. Then she figured out what had happened. As she'd cast transport, someone else had cast repulse, throwing the force of her cast back at her. Parthenia wouldn't have sent the defensive cast, which meant only one thing. Castiel was smiling triumphantly. "You have no idea of the satisfaction that gave me, Carina. I have finally demonstrated my natural superiority over you. All our brothers and sisters thought you were so wonderful and powerful and wise, just because you'd learned true casting, not the watered-down version Mother taught. But I knew I was the one who truly deserved their respect and awe, not you. Now my gift has finally arrived, and my chance has come to receive my due from you and all the others. The things I'll do, Carina, the victories I'll achieve, with me leading all of you." She was barely listening to Castiel as she went over her options. Of all the obstacles she'd imagined she might face in rescuing her sister, this one had never entered her mind. She couldn't transport Parthenia while their brother was here to stop her. Though the power of his repulse had surprised her, she thought she could probably defeat him at casting. However, she was entirely unprepared. She would need time to think up a strategy and tactics. A sound came from the other room. She saw with relief that Rhys had come into the suite. Maybe he could pin Castiel down or otherwise distract him and she could retrieve Parthenia. She rose to her feet. "Rhys, quick, come here! Grab that boy!" "Oh no," said Rhys, advancing. "It isn't him I'll be grabbing." He lunged at her. She stepped aside just in time, and his momentum carried him past her. What was he doing? Then she saw it all. Right from the beginning, the entire escapade had been an elaborate trap set by Langley and her son. They'd allowed her to escape, and since then they'd been stringing her along, hoping to find out more about casting and her connections with other mages. Rhys lunged for a second time. She kicked out at him, catching him in his stomach. That stopped him momentarily. He bent over, coughing. She had to act fast. Harmon would be returning to consciousness any minute, and Castiel could cast at her. She would be entering into a battle she could not win. If she remained here, both she and Parthenia would be trapped. She had only one choice, though it broke her heart to do it. She tipped the elixir bottle into her mouth and swallowed. "I'm sorry," she said to Parthenia, "but don't give up hope. I'm coming back." With that, she cast transport and was gone. Chapter 33. Carina appeared in the street outside the temple. Luckily, it was the middle of the night, so no one was around. She hoped the twins had done exactly as she'd asked and transported themselves and Darius to the same place not long after she and Rhys had left. The Dirksen kid had betrayed her after all, just when she'd begun to trust him. For a while she'd believed he might be different from the rest of his clan, but he'd only been pretending so he could be around her and learn about casting. He and his mother had probably wanted to see if she knew other mages. Maybe they were hoping she was in contact with Darius. The Dirksens had known about his existence for a long time. She was glad she had taken the precaution of telling her siblings to leave the apartment. Rhys had probably arranged for his people to go there and kidnap her sister and brothers as soon as she was gone. And Castiel? Her brother's reappearance had been even more of a surprise. His casting ability was a serious concern, especially the nature of his casts. The repulse she had experienced had felt wrong, and the fact that his ability had shown itself so late in his development was odd too. What it meant, she didn't know. Not for the first time she rued the fact that she had been so young when Nine had died, and that Ma had been so sick and with so little time to live while she'd known her. As a result, her knowledge of mage lore was sparse. She walked through the quiet courtyard in front of the temple and passed across the doorless threshold. The temple had been the only place she could think of to send her siblings where they would be safe, and then it would only be for a little while. Dirksen thugs would search everywhere Rhys could think of that she might go. She would have to take her siblings somewhere else soon. The ancient frieze on the wall of the temple's antechamber seemed to greet her. What had the priestess been telling her about the painting when Rhys had stuck his head in the door? It had been something about how each element in the scene represented a sin. She couldn't remember which material represented which sin, but the priestess's explanation had seemed very strange. It was nothing like her understanding of what they meant, based on the knowledge Nine had passed down. Yet in the morning ritual she had seen a priest burn a character. The other acolytes may have been burning characters too. She hadn't been paying attention. However, the final scroll to be burned had displayed only dots and figures. The religion of the temple seemed to be tied up with magehood, but she didn't understand how. She also didn't have time to figure it out. Quickly she went down a passage to one side of the central statues of deities and emerged in the larger rear room where she'd spent a night sleeping on a bench. The room was empty. Where were Oriana and Fern and Darius? Her stomach clenched. Had her siblings transported here or not? Were they still in the apartment or, more likely, in the custody of the Dirksen clan by now? As she stood hesitating about what to do, the young priestess who had helped her the last time she was here came out of the door at the rear of the chamber. "I believe you're looking for some children?" she asked. "Yes, I am." "They are waiting for you in here. Please come through." The hooded figure returned through the door. She hesitated again. Was it another trap? Had the Dirksen arrived here before her? Darius popped out. "Carina!" he called behind him. "She's here, everyone!" before running over and grabbing her hand. Then he stopped. "Where's Parthenia?" "I'm sorry, Darius. I couldn't get her." The little boy's features fell. She continued, "But I'm going to go back," just as soon as she figured out how to free her sister. His face brightened. "You'll get her. I know you will. Come on, everyone's waiting for you." He pulled her through the doorway into a small, dingy room, lit by nothing but an old lamp and a small fire burning in a grate. The priestess was nowhere to be seen. Oriana and Fern were here, however, sitting down facing her as she came through the door. Someone else was here too. A man sat opposite the twins, his back toward her. Her hand gripped Darius's tighter. Who had infiltrated her family this time? The man stood up and turned. At first she didn't recognize him. Then she took a closer look and nearly fell over. It was Bryce. "Carina!" He strode over and enveloped her in a hug. Through her surprise, she hugged him back, but then she pulled away. "What are you doing here? I thought you'd gone back to Ithia." "Why would you think that?" "You have to run your family's business." He frowned. "Yeah, I remember that's what you thought I was going to do the last time we were separated. You were wrong then. What made you think you'd be right this time around? Carina, don't you get it? I want to be with you." Fern put a hand over his mouth and snickered. Oriana elbowed him in the side. Bryce glanced at the twins over his shoulder and then returned his gaze to Carina, mildly embarrassed but not really caring. Before she could think of a suitable reply to his declaration, he went on, "Wait, where's Parthenia? The kid said you'd gone to rescue her from the Dirksens." "I couldn't," she replied, entirely forgetting her surprise at Bryce's appearance as she recalled the scared eyes of her sister. "Everything's worse than I thought. Castiel has her." "Castiel!" exclaimed Fern and Oriana in unison. She told them Castiel had skillfully inserted himself into Langley Dirksens' household. He must have decided to ally himself with the Dirksens. Then he set about trying to find us so we can be his acolytes. I have to try to get Parthenia out, and soon. They might move her somewhere else, and I don't trust Castiel not to do something awful to her. She knew that if her oldest brother was anything like his father, there were no depths he wouldn't sink to, though she didn't want to go into details in front of the children. "Why is Castiel helping the Dirksens?" Oriana asked. "He's a Shura. It doesn't make any sense." "He probably has some deluded idea about lording it over them. Idiot! As if any of the Dirksens are going to allow some kid to boss them around. He'll receive a wake-up call soon enough, but I plan on us being long gone before that happens. I just need to get Parthenia first." "Well, I'm here to help you," Bryce said. She studied her friend. Though they'd only been apart for a short time, he seemed to have changed. His beard was thicker and he'd filled out a little. That was why she hadn't recognized him immediately. "I don't understand. How did you find us? Is it just a coincidence you were here when the children arrived?" "No coincidence. When you transported me to the planet, alone," he glared at her, "I appeared in this city. I nearly frightened the life out of a tramp. He ran off shouting something about ghosts. You ran out of elixir, didn't you? That's why you sent me here by myself." "Yeah, I'd used it all up. I only had enough left for one person." "So whoever was boarding the shuttle, you decided you were going to face them alone? Don't do that to me in the future, okay? I would have stayed with you if I'd known the situation, but you didn't give me a choice." "Okay." Having Bryce with her when she'd been captured by the Dirksens would have complicated matters tenfold. But her friend did have a point. "When I realized you hadn't transported yourself too," he continued, I thought I would try to find you and your brothers and sisters. From then onward, I've been wandering the city, visiting places where people might go to lie low. A couple of days ago I came here. It was the only place where someone who fitted your description had been seen. The priestess said you'd been interested in the pictures out the front, so I guessed you might return. Since then I've been back 2 or 3 times a day, hoping you would show. Bryce was just leaving when we transported into the courtyard, Oriana said. We made him jump. You certainly did, he said. She smiled. She was relieved that Bryce was okay, though she was also somewhat alarmed by his feelings for her. The priestess returned to the chamber. Will you be spending the night here? She asked. We have a small room for the homeless, though it only holds 2 beds. However, you're all welcome to stay. Yes, we are, Darius said. I'm tired. No, said Carina. Thank you, but we're leaving now. Why? Oriana asked. Yes, why can't we stay? Asked Vern. I'm tired too. It isn't safe for us. Other people might guess we're here. People who want to hurt us. We have to find somewhere else to sleep tonight. She paused. But she didn't know when she would return to the temple, if ever. She might never have the chance to find out what link the religion had with magehood. Before we go, she said, could you tell me more about your religion? Or do you have anything I could read about it? Chapter 34. After finding a hotel to stay at, Carina opened the room's interface to find the religion's database while the children settled down to sleep. The holy book of the religion was too old and fragile to be handled, but each page had been copied onto a database that was free to anyone to read. The priestess had given her the name of the site before they left. Bryce sat down beside her as she studied the pages. The pictures of the holy book were in the same style as the friezes that decorated the temple, only much better quality and in greater detail. She hadn't seen much art in her life, but the images in the religious text looked well painted to her. Though the figures were tiny, their facial expressions were naturalistic and nuanced, and the landscapes and buildings represented looked realistic, though they were unfamiliar and archaic. I wonder why they put all this stuff in a book, Bryce asked. Why not create it on an interface? A file wouldn't suffer the same wear and tear. I guess they thought a book would last longer. They thought a book would last longer? From what I can tell, the thing's falling apart. Yes, but the priestess said the book was thousands of years old. Do you know of any files that old? I don't. True enough. What does it say? The text was legible, but the language was indecipherable. Oh, look, there's a translation. She opened the relevant page. In the beginning, the people came, arrived from the stars that gave them birth. They travelled in celestial vessels, filled with every food they might desire in an unending supply, provided to give them nourishment throughout their long voyage. First to set foot on the given planet was Lomek. She brought with her 2 sons, Seer and Sorn. Seer and Sorn brought with them their wives, Lani and Perlu. Seer and Lani brought with them 5 children. Do we have to read this? Bryce asked. It's just a long list of names. You don't have to read anything. Go to bed if you like. But you're right, I don't think I'm going to learn much here. What are you looking for, anyway? I didn't know you were interested in religion. I'm not. Carina explained what had prompted her to investigate the religious beliefs on Ostalon. You think it might have something to do with mages? I would have thought you would know all about them, considering you are one. In the time she and Bryce had spent on the shuttle after escaping from the Shurers, Carina hadn't told him much about her past. She'd been careful to keep the conversation about him or other neutral topics, but she guessed he had proven his loyalty and trustworthiness enough for her to tell him about mage law. I only know what my grandmother told me, she explained. She died when I was young, so I don't remember everything very well. Mage history, how to cast, everything in fact. All we know about being a mage is passed on orally. Nothing is ever written down, and we don't have family photographs or anything else that might link us to other mages. It's the only way we can remain safe. So you don't know any other mages apart from your family? That's right. I didn't even know about them until I happened to rescue Darius from the Dirksens, and then I didn't find out he was my brother until Stefan Scherer found me and reunited me with Ma. Yeah. She paused, thinking that Bryce was one of the few people she'd met who had some idea of what she'd been through. Anyway, if there is something in this religion that has to do with mages, I want to find out more if I can. Okay, what else does it say? He swiped to the next page. The initial chapter of the Holy Book went into a lot of detail about the first settlers on the planet. It also explained the world was a paradise provided for the colonists by their deities. The information was quite interesting, but it wasn't until the second chapter Carina saw anything that seemed significant. In the second year, the people tilled the fields, grew crops and harvested them. The people hunted in the woods and brought home meat. They birthed more children and their numbers swelled. All was good, and the people lived in peace and prosperity. But then they discovered their new world was blighted. An alien race had arrived before them and stolen their rightful home. These others were not people. They had disguised themselves to resemble people so they could walk among them and befriend them. Yet these others tricked the people, doing things that people could not. The aliens could disappear in the wink of an eye and reappear in another place altogether. They could move objects without touching them. They could bend the people to do their bidding. The alien race was evil, and the people knew they would never be safe until the aliens were expelled from the world. Her hand went to her mouth. Bryce said what was on her mind. The aliens sound like mages. By the time Carina finished reading the Holy Book, it was so late it was nearly morning. She closed the interface and went to bed. She had time to sleep for a couple of hours before the children woke up. Then she had to make a plan on how to rescue Parthenia. Bryce was squeezed into a narrow space between Darius and the wall on one of the beds, with Fern sleeping on the other edge of the bed on the verge of falling off. Darius was lying on his back between them, arms outstretched, looking like a sea creature she had once seen on a forgotten planet. The animal had been flat and its 5 limbs splayed out. With only Oriana to share a bed with, she had more room than poor Bryce or Fern. Yet though she was exhausted, she didn't fall asleep right away. The stories from the ancient book replayed in her mind, though she saw them from the perspective of the mages. What had happened during the time in which the book was set had become clear to her when she'd read between the lines. Thousands of years ago, mages had settled on Ostalon. The planet might have been one of the first they'd fled to after leaving Earth. Then, sometime later, another group of settlers had arrived. The new colonists might have already been following a religion that told them the planet was their rightful home, or the religion might have sprung up as divine justification for the persecution of mages. It was plain that the newcomers had felt threatened by the mage's powers. Her ancestors might have become lax about hiding what they could do since leaving Earth, possibly many generations before. Whatever the reason, the new settlers hadn't wanted to share their world with these people who had strange abilities. They deemed the practices of mages immoral and probably made them illegal. The elements that were so important to mages became representative of sins, and the characters had to be destroyed, perhaps as a metaphor for what the colonists wanted to do to the mages. The ritual at the end of the mech battle's performance suddenly made sense. The priestess had said that pouring the elixir into sand was to cleanse the participants of their sins. At some point, the newcomers had justified pouring away stocks of elixir by saying they were purifying the mages of evil. The only reminder that mages had once lived on Ostalon were their inaccurate representation in stories in a holy book and a few traditional dishes in the local cuisine. Though in her time the planet was a nowhere place at the edge of the galactic sector, at one point in its history it must have been one of the first to have been settled from Earth. Her heart skipped a beat. Did that mean Earth was comparatively nearby? "Can't sleep?" Bryce whispered from across the room. She lifted herself onto her elbow. "No, you neither." I know it's asking a lot, but I need more than a hand's breadth of space to relax in." She chuckled. "Sorry about Darius. Push him out of the way if you like. I don't think he'll wake up." "It's okay. I just realized I never told you how happy I was to find you again." "Bryce, I'm happy you found me too." She really meant it. For the first time in her life, she thought she'd met a non-mage she could completely trust. Chapter 35. Parthenia had cried herself to sleep, and the following morning when Harmon woke her and told her she had to go down to breakfast, she refused. The large man bristled, but seemed to think twice about his response. He said nothing and left the suite. Another guard arrived to take his place. Harmon had been watching her all night, presumably to catch Carina if she repeated her rescue attempt. A few minutes later, Langley Dirksen arrived and sent the replacement guard out. She was dressed in loose-fitting light pyjamas, covered by a robe made of similarly fine, expensive material. She was only lightly made up. Perhaps it was due to the dim light through the window blinds or the woman's age and luxurious clothes, but Parthenia was briefly reminded of her mother. Another bout of sobbing threatened, and it was as much as she could do to control herself. Langley seemed to sense her vulnerable state. The woman's expression was soft with sympathy as she stood in the bedroom doorway. "Do you mind if I come in?" Determined not to open her mouth lest she begin to cry, Parthenia didn't reply. Langley came in anyway. She sat next to her on the side of the bed. "My dear, you look exhausted. I imagine you hardly slept. There's no need for you to come down to breakfast if you don't feel like it. I can ask one of the maids to bring something up to you. How does that sound?" Finally, Parthenia trusted herself to speak. "I'm not hungry." "Is that so? I'm surprised. Your sister had quite the appetite." At the mention of Carina's name, Parthenia's lower lip turned out and she had to swallow. She'd seen Carina for only a moment, less than a minute, for the first time since she'd arrived on Ostalon. After waiting and hoping for so long her sister would find and help her and her siblings, Carina had finally appeared, but then she'd left again. She had left her in the hands of Castiel and the Dirksens. She was trying hard not to feel abandoned, but she wasn't succeeding. Langley reached out and placed a hand on top of hers. She snatched her hand away and thrust it under the coverlet. "Parthenia, may I call you that? I understand how you feel, and I know I would feel the same in your circumstances. You've had a very difficult time recently. Your brother has told me all about it. You must have been terrified to find yourself alone on a strange planet with no one to turn to. I can't imagine what you must have been forced to do to survive. You must be very brave and resourceful. I doubt I could have done the same. I have so much admiration for you." Langley was gazing in her eyes, a soft, compassionate expression on her face. She continued, "You see, you and I are quite alike, aren't we? We were both raised within the comfort and privilege of a powerful clan. We wanted for nothing, and, if your parents were as indulgent as mine, we could have whatever we asked for. To live a life like that and then suddenly find yourself in an entirely different environment where you had absolutely nothing and were in fear for your life. What a challenge that must have been. And yet you met it." Tilting her head, Langley paused, allowing her words to linger. She was right, Parthenia realized. She had had a terrible time when she'd walked with Darius through the forest. She had had to seek help from the ranger and do so many other things, including going for help when Fern had been shot. All the time she'd been worried she was making bad decisions, but actually she'd done as well as could have been expected. Perhaps she'd been too hard on herself, but what did any of that matter? She wanted to make sure that Carina had helped Fern and her siblings. "I want to leave," she blurted. "But why?" Langley asked. "Don't you like it here? This is a beautiful room in a beautiful house. We have wonderful grounds for you to wander in. You can have whatever you want. You only need to ask for it. Isn't this the life you're used to?" "I want to be with my family. It doesn't matter that this is the kind of life I used to lead. Maybe I wasn't happy then. Have you considered that?" Despite her words, Parthenia recognized the truth of what Langley was saying. Her time on Ostalon since Carina had transported her down here had been awful. A small part of her did yearn for the indulgent life she was accustomed to, even though she'd known that Mother was unhappy and no one except Father had much freedom. At least she'd never suffered a moment's physical discomfort. At least she'd been safe. "Your brother has told me about your lives on Ithia, and to be honest, it doesn't sound that bad. None of us can have everything we want. That would be selfish and unreasonable. We must accept that sometimes sacrifices and compromises are necessary. That's the correct, mature attitude to have in life. Don't you agree?" Parthenia did agree, but she didn't want to say so. Agreeing with Langley Dirksen felt wrong. Of course it was wrong. The woman was holding her against her will. Parthenia was muddled. "You shouldn't listen to Castiel. He's a bad person. He scared and hurt Nala, and last night he gagged me and forced me to stay beside him when Carina came to rescue me." "Ah, your sister," said Langley. "Another troubled young lady. She also didn't understand the advantages of using her powers for good. But you were talking about Castiel, weren't you? I agree. His behavior is excessive at times. I shall speak to him about it. Of course, he had to prevent your sister from taking you from us and returning you to hardship and a difficult life. But he must learn to be more kind and reasonable. Perhaps you can help me to persuade him." Once more she was at a loss. Castiel certainly did need to learn to behave better, but she didn't feel she was the person who should teach him. That wasn't her responsibility. Or was it? She was his older sister, after all, and Mother had loved Castiel the same as she'd loved all her children. Perhaps she'd seen good in him that wasn't apparent to anyone else. Maybe Mother would have liked her to show Castiel some compassion. Langley smiled. She pressed her hand where it lay beneath the covers. The woman's touch felt warm and comforting. She suddenly missed her mother very, very much. "Don't worry, dear," said Langley. "You're still upset from everything you've been through since you arrived. It's entirely understandable you need time to recover and think things through before making any decisions. Take all the time you want. You're at a very important crossroads. One way lies a wonderful life doing good and helping people while enjoying the very best every world has to offer. The other way lies uncertainty, never knowing where your next meal will come from, and fear of discovery preventing you from helping others. Langley stood up and tightened the ties on her robe. Would you like something to eat? Breakfast is still warm. She looked down. This time guilt bothered her while she refused to reply. For a powerful member of a powerful clan, Langley Dirksen didn't seem as bad as she would have imagined. Langley left, and she gave vent to her feelings again, burying her face in her pillow. Even when she'd been trapped in the security room at the spaceport or in the cell at the holding center, she'd never felt so alone. At those times she'd been focused on returning to her siblings and desperately worried about them. Now she guessed Carina was with them. That had to be how her older sister had discovered where she was. It meant that Darius, Oriana, Fern and Carina were all together, and Parthenia was the one who was apart from them. Carina had come for her, just as she'd said she would. Her sister had kept true to her word, and yet the awful feeling that had pervaded her the previous night returned. Carina had left her. She'd left, even though she knew she was trapped and Castiel was holding her hostage. Why had Carina gone away? She could do anything. She was an amazing fighter, and she could cast expertly, while Castiel was still new to the skill. He should have been easy for Carina to defeat. Yet after only a brief try, she had abandoned her to the Dirksens. She had said she would come back, but would she? And when? Chapter 36. Carina, Bryce and the children crowded around a table at a diner. It was a small, cheap, grubby place, but she had checked the establishment took cash before they sat down. Bryce had money from some casual labour he'd picked up to survive while searching for them. The man behind the counter nodded in reply without removing his gaze from an erotic hollow playing on a lower counter, barely out of view. She asked him to turn the volume down a little so the children wouldn't hear. Oriana, Fern and Darius squabbled over who would be first to order from the interface at the table until she made them stop. She told them she would order the worst-tasting breakfast on the menu if they didn't behave. She rolled her eyes at Bryce, reflecting that, for children who had been brought up by a cruel monster, they sometimes showed little sign of it. She guessed that Ma must have shielded them from Stefan's nastiness much of the time. Bryce was wearing an amused expression. "What?" she asked. "Is something funny? You're pretty young to be a mum." "Huh, I didn't get much choice about it." "Well, you're doing a great job, especially considering it was thrust upon you." She glanced at the twins and Darius, who had begun to argue again, this time about what the others were ordering, though more quietly. They seemed distracted enough to not be listening. "Honestly, though it's hard," she said, "I didn't have anyone I could be open with about being a mage until I met this little gang. It's isolating to be always keeping back a part of yourself from everyone you know. For a long while I thought I was used to it, but then when I met Darius and I discovered there was perhaps an entire family of mages I could meet, I was so excited. I realized I'd been sad, deep down, for a long time." She drew breath, a feeling of panic rising in her. Although she knew its cause, her words to Bryce were probably the most frank she'd ever been about her feelings to anyone, ever. That didn't dampen her visceral reaction. "Anyway," she went on, quickly steering away from dwelling on her emotions, "now I only need to get Parthenia back. Then we can all be together. I just haven't figured out how yet." Perhaps sensing her discomfort, he also focused on a new topic. "What happened when you went to the Dirksen estate?" She filled him in, finishing with, Part of the problem is that in any plan I think up, Castiel is an unknown. If we end up casting directly at each other, it's hard to be sure I can defeat him. I got some sense of his power last night, and at the time I thought I would probably be stronger than him if it were put to the test, but I wouldn't like to bet on it. What if you had the others helping you? She shook her head emphatically. I am not taking them with me. It's too risky. An ancient servitor trundled up to the table, its shelves bearing breakfast dishes. She lifted the plates out and slid them across to the children, who had already forgotten what they ordered. 3 dishes were passed back due to their being apparently unfit for human consumption. Bryce picked up some kind of toasted vegetable, nibbled on it, and announced it was the most delicious thing he had ever tasted. "Wait," Fern said. "I remember I ordered that." "It's mine now," Bryce retorted. "You said you didn't want it." "But I changed my mind." "Oh, okay. Here you go then." Bryce pushed the plate back. She grinned. "How did you come to be so good at this?" "I'm the eldest of a similar brood." "Well, don't do any more of that. I'm hungry, and from the look of it there aren't going to be any leftovers." As everyone ate, she tried to think up a plan for extracting Parthenia from the Dirksen estate. If it had only been non-mages she was facing, she didn't think she would have had too many problems. Casting gave her an edge in most situations, but going up against another mage brought up the possibility of an entirely different set of scenarios. Castiel's time spent witnessing Mars' lessons on casting with his siblings probably meant he knew just about everything she could do. He would be able to think up defences and counterattacks to defeat her. Darius was fidgeting vigorously in his seat. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "I need to go to the bathroom." She slid across the bench and stood up to let him out. As she sat down again, Darius said, "I know how we can get Parthenia back." "Really?" Carina said, wondering if her little brother could read her thoughts. "How?" "We fly in on Reese's Star Racer and grab her. Then we fly away again." "That's a good idea, Darius, but we can't borrow Reese's Star Racer. He isn't our friend anymore." "Oh, good," Darius said. "I never liked him. I didn't like the feeling he gave me." "You didn't? Why didn't you tell me?" "I don't know. You didn't ask." Next time you get that feeling about someone, Darius, let me know, okay?" "Okay." The little boy skipped off to the restroom at the back of the diner. "What was that about?" Bryce asked. "Darius is a special kind of mage, I think. Ma suspected it too. He picks up on people's emotions very strongly." "So he knew there was something off about the Dirksen guy?" "Yeah, I think he did. I wish I'd thought to ask him." "Shame he didn't tell you." "It probably wouldn't have made a lot of difference. I would have gone to get Parthenia anyway, thinking I could easily transport us both out of there, no matter what trap the Dirksen woman had laid for me. I didn't know Castiel was waiting." "I was wondering," Bryce said, "if Castiel can cast, why didn't he just put you in a locked room the minute he saw you?" "Because I had elixir with me, and I would have cast my way out again. He needed to get the elixir off me first. Besides, I think he's playing a longer game. He wants all of us, not only me and Parthenia. Then he can play at being the head of a mage family, just like his dad. Maybe he's hoping I'll bring everyone along next time." Darius returned and she moved again to let him back into his seat. "Did you figure out how we're going to get Parthenia?" "Not yet." "I wish we had a Star Racer. Then it would be easy." She didn't think that rescuing her sister was going to be easy at all, Star Racer or not. But Darius's suggestion had given her an idea. Maybe she'd been focusing too heavily on Castiel's mage power and not enough on what he couldn't do. Her brother had no military experience, and Langley and the other Dirksens wouldn't suspect she might try to extract her sister with brute force. An armed attack would take them by surprise. But how could she buy weapons? "What's wrong?" Darius asked. "I thought I had an idea, but I realized it won't work. It would cost a lot of money that we don't have." "We could work for it," said Bryce. "Or maybe I could ask my parents for some." "Both of those would take too long. We have to get Parthenia out soon. If we wait weeks or months, they might move her somewhere else, even off-planet. My plan would require a lot of cash, and we would need it fast, like in the next few days." Her eyes widened, and she sat up straight. "You thought of an idea!" Darius exclaimed. He clapped his hands. "Yay! We're going to get Parthenia!" Chapter 37. The Mech Battle Company secretary didn't take Carina seriously. The woman looked her up and down before saying, "Sorry, we're all booked up for the next few months. Come back later." "I'm an ex-merc," Carina said. "I've used mechs before." "Sorry, that wouldn't make us any less booked up even if I believed you. Please, give me a chance. I would put on a really good show. Look, I'm trying to do you a favor. Find another way to earn a fast buck, okay? Because if you go into that pit, you aren't coming out alive." As she spoke, a door behind her slid open and a heavily muscled, very hairy man walked out into the lobby. "Mech fighting is for people like this great lunk," the secretary said. "It isn't for young women." "Another kid who wants to fight?" he asked the secretary, not making eye contact with Carina. "Yeah," she replied. "You finished for the day?" "Yep, off to get this scar taken out." He showed the woman a broad, angry, fresh scar running from his shoulder down his back. "I like to leave them in a while to impress the girls, but this one's a pain in the ass. Restricts movement in my arm." "Call that a scar?" asked Carina. "That's nothing. Take a look at these." She turned and lifted her top over her back. During her time as a merc, she'd gotten into plenty of scrapes where the cheap armor provided by the company hadn't been adequate protection. Shipboard medical facilities didn't cover scar removal, and Carina had never wanted to go to Splicer's planet side. She guessed that mage abilities were in her genetic code, and she didn't want anyone getting their hands on hers if she could help it. From the silence behind her, she guessed the secretary and the lunk was suitably impressed. She lowered her top and turned to face them. "What do you say?" she asked. The woman glanced at the mech battle fighter, whose eyebrows were raised. She pointed toward an old cargo mech standing in the corner of the room. "If you can operate that, I'll put your name down. Don't get your hopes up too much, though. The boss has the final say." Carina went over to the ancient machine. It was even older than the outdated model she'd worked with during her time on her company's ship, Duchess. Stepping backward and upward into the mech's center, she sought out the feet and hand controls. The front shield lowered automatically, also giving her access to the eye-tracking controls. She was locked in and ready to go. She walked the mech forward. Its response time was slow, each leg moving as much as a quarter of a second after she activated it. She hoped the models they used for fighting weren't similarly sluggish. Odd mechanical parts were piled in the middle of the floor. She was supposed to demonstrate she could pick them up and manipulate them, but she needed to do something much showier and more memorable if she were to be picked to fight. She walked the mech past the pile and approached the secretary's desk. The hiss-clunk of the mech's legs loud in her ears. The secretary looked alarmed. "No, no, no!" she exclaimed. "Go back there! Move those things around!" Carina continued on her original track. The secretary jumped up and backed against the wall, but it wasn't her she wanted. The lunk was standing behind the desk, his hands on his hips, smiling broadly. Carina guessed he must be impressed. She was about to impress him further. She reached forward with the mech's pincers. At the last second, the man realised what she was about to do, and he tried to jump out of the way. He was too late. She grabbed him around his biceps. She held him firmly enough that he wouldn't slip, but delicately enough not to hurt him. When she had a good grip on his biceps, she used the mech's second set of pincers to grab his thighs. "Whoa!" the lunk exclaimed, chuckling. "Take it easy, girl." She lifted him up and then turned him horizontal so he was parallel with the ceiling. "Oh, my stars!" the secretary wailed. "Put him down!" Carina spun the man around once. As he was roaring with laughter, she spun him around a second time. Then she lowered him to his previous position. As soon as she had released him, he doubled over, slapping the desk and laughing too hard to speak. Carina walked the mech back to the wall and climbed out of it. The secretary had been crouching while all this was going on. She stood and straightened her clothes. "Well, that was quite the demonstration," she said as she returned to her desk. "You didn't need to go quite that far. I would have put your name down anyway." She opened her interface. "What is it?" "Tamira. Lan. Can I see your ID?" I don't have any." "Ah," said the secretary. "That could be a problem." "Give her a chance," said the lunk. "You know half the IDs you see in here are fake. The boss'll love her." Okay, Tamira. Call me Tammy." "Tammy. The owner will be here at 5, a couple of hours before the show starts. If you come back then, perhaps he'll give you a shot." "Tonight?" Carina asked. "No, definitely not tonight. But he might find you something within the next few days." Her disappointment must have shown. "It's the best I can do," said the secretary. "Take it or leave it." Without a large sum of money, her plan to attack the Dirksen estate military style would never work. She needed a hover vessel, weapons, and ammunition at the very least. Ideally, she would like smoke grenades and other accessories that would make the rescue attempt easier. Winning a mech battle was the only way she knew she could obtain the necessary funds quickly. She hoped a few days wouldn't make too much difference to Parthenia, and that Langley wouldn't move her sister someplace else. Then it occurred to her that the waiting time would allow her and Bryce to earn more money, which they could then bet on her winning her fight. Of course, there was the small detail of her winning to consider. That wasn't guaranteed at all. She had never actually fought in any mech, let alone the monsters used for the mech battles. But what the secretary offered was better than any alternative she knew. "I'll take it. I'll be back later." Bryce was waiting for her outside. "They turned you down, right?" "What? Of course not. They were practically begging me to fight, and tonight. I had to put them off for a few days. We need to earn some money and make some arrangements." They walked down the long road through the lot that led into the city. The last time she had walked this road, she hadn't thought she would ever be back, and least of all that she would be fighting in a mech battle. "They turned you down at first, though," Bryce said. "Didn't they?" "Yeah, I had to show off a bit to persuade them." "I thought so. Where to next?" "Wait a minute." She took out a flask of elixir, sipped a little, and then sent to Oriana. After checking the children were okay in their hotel room, she said, "We have to see about those arrangements." Chapter 38. Langley Dirksen had given Parthenia an exquisite dress to wear to the soiree. Somehow the woman had known exactly the most flattering colours, style and fitting. Though Parthenia felt embarrassed to admit it as she gazed at herself in the mirror, she had never looked so beautiful. Mixed in with her embarrassment was a large portion of guilt. She shouldn't have agreed to meet Langley Dirksen's relations, friends and business associates at the informal party. She felt sure that Carina wouldn't have agreed to it in her position, yet Parthenia had feared what might happen if she said no. When Langley had asked her, she had noticed the woman's expression turn rigid as she waited for an answer, then relax when she had reluctantly said yes. She had only acquiesced because she was worried what Castiel might do to her if she didn't, or, even worse, what he might do to Nala. Her brother had already caught on that she was frightened he would hurt her little sister, and, like his father before him, he wouldn't be slow to exploit the fact. Castiel had been watching from the corner of the room when Langley Dirksen had made her request, and he'd smiled when Parthenia had nodded. A familiar feeling of suffocation was sinking over her. Though it was only her second day in the mansion, she was beginning to feel very much at home. So many things contributed to the sensation. Luxurious surroundings, servants, expensive, perfectly cooked meals, and polite, well-mannered behavior expected at all times. Most influential of all to her, however, was Castiel's presence. Like a brooding malevolence, he seemed to be around her wherever she went, watching and judging, ready to pounce when she stepped out of line, just like their father. She hated how she was so used to the environment that it felt comfortable. She didn't know how she could ever break out of it. She didn't dare to try. Perhaps she didn't want to try. If she failed in her attempt, she might lose all hope. Don't give up hope, Carina had said, but she hadn't said when she would be back or how she would help her escape. A constant guard meant that Carina couldn't transport in and transport out with her, and the Dirksen estate was probably heavily defended. What chance did Carina stand against the might of the Dirksens? She was only one person, and their siblings were too young to be of much help. On the other hand, Carina had managed to escape from the Shurers, Parthenia had to admit. If her sister could do that, maybe she could defeat the Dirksens too. She would try not to give up hope. In the meantime, she would go along with whatever Langley Dirksen wanted. It would keep Castiel happy and hopefully prevent him from hurting Nala as a coercion tactic. It shouldn't be too hard. All her life, Parthenia had been wearing pretty dresses and smiling nicely to keep everyone happy. When she arrived at the party downstairs, Langley Dirksen's guests all turned to look at her. They seemed apprehensive, almost afraid of what she might do or say. She could feel herself blush in response to all the attention. She hovered in the doorway, tempted to turn around and go back to her suite. "Come in, dear," Langley called from across the room. She was sitting with a group of women who all wore fantastical hairstyles. Langley rose and swept across the room to take her arm. "You look stunning," she whispered in her ear as she guided her through the groups of partygoers who were returning to their conversations now she'd made her entrance. She experienced the same guilty thrill she'd felt when she'd looked at herself in the mirror in her bedroom. Her feelings were in turmoil. Her younger mage sisters and brothers were struggling to survive, even if Carina had found them, as she hoped. Yet here she was, wearing beautiful clothes and going to parties. It wasn't what she'd chosen, yet she hadn't refused to participate either. She caught sight of a pair of dark eyes through the crowd and inwardly flinched. Castiel was here, watching her. He was wearing a suit and looking much older than his years. He gave her a wink and turned away to speak to someone in his group. It was as though he knew exactly how she felt, and the knowledge of her discomfort and inner conflict pleased him. She wondered if Castiel was like Darius, able to pick up on the emotions of those around him, no matter how hard they tried to hide them. The women in Langley's group were gazing at her as Langley brought her over. Like Langley, they all had a slightly greedy look, though none displayed even an ounce of extra fat. They had all probably been at a splicer's today, having their bodies refined to perfection for the party.
"Everyone," said Langley, "this is Parthenia, the very special young woman I was telling you about."
"Lovely to meet you, Parthenia," said a woman whose hair rose up from her head in a perfect spiral. "Effie, move along, dear," she said to another woman sitting on the sofa. "Make room for Parthenia." Effie shifted across the sofa, creating space for one more person. Parthenia sank down, a sudden desire to escape overwhelming her. She wanted to sink right into the furniture and away from these predatory women. The spiral-haired woman handed her a bowl containing iced treats. The bowl itself was also icy, refrigerated by the table it had been sitting on. "Try one," the woman said. "They're delicious." She was staring at her intensely, almost angrily, though Parthenia couldn't figure out why. It was the first time they'd met. She took a treat and ate it, grateful that it melted and slipped down her throat easily. Her mouth was as dry as a bone.
"I have very big plans in store for Parthenia," Langley said. "Very big. We're going to work closely together, aren't we, my dear? I imagine she'll become like a daughter to me."
Parthenia coughed. "How exciting," Effie said. "Parthenia, I heard you only just arrived on Ostalon. What do you think of the place so far?" "Oh, it seems nice." It was all she could think of to say. Most of her time on Ostalon had been spent running and hiding. It wasn't like she'd taken a tour of the place. "I love it here," Effie enthused, continuing as if she hadn't heard what Parthenia had said. "It's so quaint, so many ancient customs still alive, like hunting. Have any of you been hunting?" she asked the group generally. The spiral-haired woman rolled her eyes. "We've all been hunting, as you know perfectly well. Personally, I didn't care for it. Riding those animals, what are they called? Horses, I believe. It left me unable to even walk. I had to have deep muscle therapy from my splicer to feel normal again."
Deep muscle therapy from your splicer," said a dark-haired woman who hadn't spoken before. "Now that's something I wouldn't say no to." "Excuse me," Langley said. "We have a young lady present, don't forget." "Oh, don't be silly," the dark-haired woman said. "I'm sure she knows a thing or two about what I mean." Parthenia sank deeper into her seat. "Mother," a voice said. She looked up to see a lanky young man standing to one side of the group of women. Her chest tightened as she recognized him. He'd been in her suite the previous night when Carina had tried to rescue her. "Rees," Langley said, "I'm so glad you've come to join us this time." "As Parthenia's here, I thought I should," Rees replied. "She'll get bored talking to all you old folk." This brought cries of outrage from the women. "Huh, old!" Effie huffed. "He's just teasing you," said Langley. "But he has a point. Rees, why don't you take Parthenia for a walk? It's getting stuffy in here, and yes, we old folk are very boring." Rees held out his hand to Parthenia, and she felt obliged to take it. He helped her up, then led her to the open double doors at the back of the room. Outside, the air was cool and refreshing. She had been riddled with tension, but she felt some of it slip away, despite the fact that Langley's son had tried to grab Carina before she escaped. "You were upstairs in my room last night," Parthenia said. "My sister seemed to know you." "Yeah, I spent some time with Carina over the last few days. She's a cool person, but she's misguided." "How is she misguided?" "She only sees the bad in everything. Mother tried to persuade her to help the Dirksen cause, but she wouldn't. I tried to point out that what we're doing is for the good over the long term, but Carina was too short-sighted to see it." "Are the Dirksens doing things for the good?"
She'd never really understood what it was the Shurers did. All she'd known about were the meetings Father had taken her to, when he'd given her detailed instructions on what he wanted her to do. Beyond that, Shurer business was a mystery to her. Absolutely. We've made enormous improvements to Ostalon since arriving here. It was a backward place before, really primitive, but now it's thriving. He turned to her. That's the kind of thing you'd be helping us do, if you worked with us. Chapter 39. Carina had been working for the Labour Agency for 3 days, and she still hadn't seen Asher. No one could tell her why the woman hadn't turned up for work. At first she hadn't been too worried. She wanted to work until the boss at the mech battle company arranged a fight for her, so she could earn money to bet on herself. But she also had good reasons for wanting to reconnect with Asher. She had expected to meet a cool reception at the agency because Asher had told her she would pull strings so Carina couldn't work there. But the agency receptionist barely seemed to remember her. At the end of her 3rd day of work, Carina decided that if she couldn't see Asher there, she would just have to go to her apartment, even if that did mean facing the vile Kavin. She had only been to Asher's home once. It was deep within the warren of cheap run-down blocks in the heart of the city. She lost her way several times before finally finding the street too narrow for hover vehicles. After she passed the noodle soup shop with its child server, she knew she was in the right place. She pressed the security panel next to Asher's door 3 or 4 times and was on the verge of leaving when the door opened a crack. "Tammy?" "Asher, what happened to you?" Though Asher was looking out through a narrow space, it was easy to see her face was purple with bruises. "Oh, I had an accident." Carina's heart sank. "Let me guess, your face had an accidental encounter with Kavin's fist. Where is he? Is he here?" "He's here, but he's asleep." "Let me in. I want to speak with him." "No, I don't want to do that. I can figure this out by myself." "You know what?" said Carina. "You're right. I'd love nothing more than to come in there and bash Kavin's brains out for you. But I know that wouldn't do any good. You do need to figure this out by yourself. But I really want to speak to him. I need him for something." "Oh, okay. I guess you can come in then." Inside Asher's apartment, everything was in disarray. It looked as if a major fight had taken place, or maybe the mess had only resulted from Asher trying to escape her no-good boyfriend. Asher hadn't been into work because she was too beat up, or perhaps because Kavin had decided to prevent her. If the latter were the case, as soon as they ran out of money, the ban on Asher working would be lifted. The idea of Kavin himself working was likely unthinkable to either of them. Carina had known many similar couples and families in the slum settlement where she'd grown up. Kavin looked like part of the general mess. He was lying on the sofa, one leg and one arm hanging down, snoring. It was an unusual time of day for a nap. She wondered if he was drugged up. If he was, that would make him difficult to talk to, but on the other hand, it would mean she'd come to the right person. She pulled the sofa out from the wall. Kavin didn't stir. She went around the back and lifted up the sofa, tipping him onto the floor. She could have just pulled him off, but she didn't want to get her hands dirty. "Ah!" he exclaimed, waking up. "Asher! What the hell are you—" "Oh, it's you." Carina was standing behind the sofa. "I need weapons and a fast hover vehicle. Something like a star racer, but a little bigger." He wiped drool from his mouth. "Yeah, okay. So what does that have to do with me?" "You know someone who can get them for me." "Huh, no I don't," Kavin replied, sitting up and rubbing his messy hair. "Then you know someone who knows someone." "What if I do?
Why should I help you? My arm still hurts, you know.
Because I'll pay you a small percentage of the cost. He looked as though his ears had pricked up, but then he said,
Pay me with what? You don't have that kind of money, or you wouldn't have been working with Asher.
I think she might, Asher said. She'd been standing in the corner watching the interaction between Carina and her boyfriend. She walked over to him and handed him their interface. Carina could see the screen, which displayed a mech battle advertisement. To her dismay, she saw herself being touted as a new challenger for the fight taking place tomorrow night. When the boss had agreed to let her take part, he'd made her stand with legs apart and pressing her fists to her hips while he took photographs. She'd thought they were just publicity images to be displayed in the stadium, not across the planetary network. She'd been stupid, she now realized. The only saving grace was that the manager had given her a mask to wear for a sense of mystery. Her stage name would be Dark Avenger, and she would be fighting on behalf of Pyreco. Although her face wasn't visible in the advertisement, anyone who knew her would guess it was her. Anyone, including Castiel, Langley, and Rees. And the latter two had a love of the mech battles. They were bound to see her, and then they would know exactly where she would be tomorrow night. But there was nothing she could do about it. She had to go ahead with her plan, or she would never be able to rescue Parthenia. Kavin was looking from the screen to her and back again.
You're right, Asher. It is her. And look at the odds.
Betting on the fight had already started. As an unknown newcomer, the bookies were offering odds of 20-1 for her to win the first battle and 100-1 if she won the tournament. Kavin said,
So this is where you're planning on getting your money? Ha! You and every other idiot before you. You'll be lucky if you come out of it intact. That isn't your call. I only need you to put me in touch with someone who has the stuff I want.
Look, I'll pay you even if I don't make a deal, okay? Asher's boyfriend fingered his stubble.
All right, but you pay me up front.
No. After the fight, I'm betting everything I have on myself.
No way. You'll lose, and then you won't have anything.
I'm not going to lose.
Of course you are. What do you know about fighting?
More than you think. Did you say your arm still hurt? Kavin rubbed the aforementioned arm. He waved dismissively and sat down.
Okay, come back later tonight. Give me 3 hours to set something up. I'll try, but I'm not promising anything. And these people are gonna say no anyway. Then I'll be in trouble for wasting their time. So you better come through with the cash.
She will, hon, said Asher. I can get her some work. She'll pay you back. She gave Carina a tiny apologetic smile. Carina sighed. Chapter 40. When Carina returned to Asher and Kavin's apartment later that night, Kavin directed her to another spot where she was to meet the people who could supply her with what she needed. After some bickering over how much and when she should pay Kavin for his service, she set out again, and she was grateful that Bryce was around to look after the twins and Darius while she was gone. Kavin had told her to go to the rooftop of a derelict apartment block a couple of streets away and wait there. When she arrived at the building, she saw that although signs were posted stating the place was condemned and dangerous to enter, squatters had moved in. The low beams of portable lamps and flickers of firelight shone from the windows, occasionally dimming as figures passed across the sources of light. Carina wasn't afraid of people who lived like this, mostly due to the fact that she had once been in a similar situation herself. But she wished she had a weapon of some kind. If anyone threatened her, flashing a weapon would quickly dissuade them from further action. She didn't want to waste time fighting. It might make her late for her appointment. But she had no weapon, only a flask of elixir. She passed through the doorless entrance. The elevators were not only not working, they were absent. The open doors revealed dark, gaping shafts. She went to the stairs and began to climb. On her way up, she sidestepped piles of trash and jumped over prone bodies that she hoped were only sleeping. She was reminded of the new block she and Asher had helped to clean before the decorators arrived. This place was quite the contrast. When she reached the top, she found the door to the roof was swinging off one broken hinge. She tugged at it until it fully broke away, then laid it flat on the rooftop. If she needed to leave the impending meeting fast, she didn't want to be struggling to get past the remains of a door. The rooftop was empty. No exact time had been set up for the meeting, so she was forced to wait and hope the dealers in illegal arms would actually turn up. She was entirely unknown to them and had no ready cash, so their main incentive would probably be curiosity. She went to the edge and gazed down to the ground about 25 stories below. If her prospective associates decided to drop her off the roof, she doubted she would be able to cast transport before she hit the ground. And if she did manage it, would her velocity continue with her to her new location? She didn't know, and she didn't want to find out. The city was quietening down, though the spaceport in the distance remained busy with the fast-moving lights of shuttles taking off and landing. As she watched the brilliantly coloured spots, she realised that two were heading in her direction. She watched them for several moments to make sure she was correct, and then ran over to the stairwell entrance and stood behind it to avoid being baked in the heat of the shuttle's landing. Sounds of engine noise grew louder while she waited. The noise grew so loud she had to cover her ears, and then the engines cut out. When she heard the shuttle doors opening, she stepped from her refuge slowly and cautiously. Spooking the kind of people she was meeting was never wise. Only one person seemed to be in charge, she was relieved to see. The woman sauntered forward in front of her subordinates, 2 males and a female. All wore floor-length coats made of some kind of animal skin. Its patterning was intricate and beautiful, though it would have looked better on the animals. The boss and her lackeys were also heavily jewelled. They wore tight gem-studded collars of a subtly glowing metal and hand ornaments that could double as knuckle dusters. Kavin did indeed know people who knew people. Carina swallowed, aware of how comparatively unimpressive she looked. The boss seemed to think so too, from the way she was looking her up and down, the expression on her face souring. Kavin had probably been forced to talk Carina up as a prospective business associate before the black market weapons trader would agree to meet her. Now the woman was experiencing a considerable letdown. Deciding it would be better not to give her time to conclude she had nothing to gain from the meeting, Carina opened the bargaining process without preamble. She stated her laundry list of proposed purchases, which included as many weapons and explosive devices as she and Bryce could carry, as well as a vehicle that would seat 6. I'd prefer space ready, but a fast hover vehicle would do if that's all you can manage. The boss hadn't spoken a word while she talked. Silence fell, and after a moment the woman looked over her shoulder at the others and gave a slight shake of her head. She turned to leave. "I can pay a lot," Carina blurted. She fingered the flask of elixir in her pocket. The woman faced her again. "That's what I was waiting to hear. How much?" When Carina named a figure, the woman laughed. Then she stopped and said, "You are joking, right? I can go higher. What would you say is a fair price?" 4 times what you just said. That might be a good place to start for the weapons.
It'll be more for the vehicle. And I want half up front.
The deal was impossible for her to fulfill. Winning the tournament and the bet she placed on herself would only give her half what the woman wanted. I'm not sure. I'll have to figure out if I have enough.
I'll take less if you pay it all now.
That would have been an incredibly stupid thing to do. If Carina gave over any money, she would be certain to never see the woman again. She seemed to think she was an idiot. I need time to think about it.
1 minute.
I'm going to take a drink, said Carina, knowing that pulling something out of her pocket suddenly might elicit an undesirable, deadly response from the lackeys. As she'd predicted, everyone tensed up.
Wait,
said the boss. She beckoned one of her subordinates and nodded toward her. The man walked up to Carina and patted her over. He quickly found the elixir flask and pulled it out. He opened it, sniffed the contents, and wrinkled his nose.
Just some weird tea,
he said to his boss, pushing the flask into her hands before returning to his side of the divide. Not hearing any further objections, she swallowed a mouthful of elixir. She returned the flask to her pocket and then rubbed her forehead as if thinking. While her hand covered her face, she closed her eyes. It was a struggle to cast enthrall while under pressure, knowing that all her plans and hopes rode on her cast succeeding, but eventually she managed it. She wasn't home free, however. She had only enthralled the boss. She might have managed to affect more of those present, but that would have diluted the cast, so it wasn't as long-lasting. She needed the boss to be enthralled for long enough to make the arrangements. Then she would be unlikely to back out, even if she couldn't remember why she'd agreed to the deal. I can't pay it all now, Carina said, or even a part of it. In fact, I can only pay you half what you want when I receive the goods, but I can... She needed something that sounded at least a little convincing to the others, or they would think their boss had gone mad. I can work for you, afterward. The man who had searched her started sniggering.
Okay, the woman said.
The man abruptly stopped laughing and stared at his boss. He then stared at his colleagues, who also seemed to not quite believe what they'd just heard. The man looked as though he wanted to say something, but he kept quiet. Thanks, Carina said. I appreciate it. She explained where and when she wanted the weapons and the vehicle, which would be after she'd won the tournament. If she won the tournament. If she didn't, she would have to lie very low indeed, assuming Castiel didn't kidnap her. Chapter 41.
Come on, said Rhys. You'll love it, I promise.
He pushed the visor into Parthenia's hands. She looked up into the young man's happy, eager face. Rhys had barely left her alone over the last few days, but she hadn't really minded. His nearly constant company meant that Castiel had little opportunity to be alone with her, and she was grateful for that, even if Rhys's attention was overwhelming at times. What do we have to do? She asked. I don't think I understand. Come outside and put on the visor. The game will make more sense to you then. Parthenia stepped through the open doors that led to the lawn. It was a beautiful day, and not for the first time she felt a little guilty about enjoying the luxury of beautiful surroundings and fine living while her siblings were probably scraping by somewhere. Although enjoying was perhaps too strong a word to describe her feelings about her captivity. She was confused and conflicted. Langley and Rhys constantly talked to her about all the good she could do with her powers, but they had also accepted Castiel into their midst. He was cruel and vicious, and Parthenia couldn't understand why they tolerated him. Put it on, Rhys urged. She pushed the band down over her head and lowered the visor. The pleasant gardens were transformed into an industrial scene. She was inside an old abandoned factory. Machines towered over her, and high above a defective fan spun, its clunk, clunk, clunk echoing. "There are code words for the weapons," Rees said. "You just have to think of them, and they'll appear. You can think of shields, too, but you have to bend down to the ground and raise them up, or they won't appear. To see the list, think the word menu." "Oh, I understand now. Fern and Oriana were asking for a system like this for ages, but Father would never allow it. So it's a kind of battle?" "That's right. It's more fun with more people, but we can still have a good game with only 2 of us. We can go wherever we want on the estate. The game will expand into new areas. Do you get it now? Do you want to play?" She wasn't very keen on the idea. She didn't much like games that involved fighting. She preferred games that tested your wits, but agreeing to play with Rees would mean a few more hours that Castiel wouldn't bother her. "Okay, I'll need a little time to figure out what everything means." "Sure, let's walk down to the grove. We won't be disturbed there, and it'll give you a while to read the menu." As they walked away from the house, Rees took her hand, which felt a bit weird, but she didn't protest. She was disoriented by walking in the new setting and trying to read the list that hovered before her in mid-air. The game modified her sense of touch as well as sight and hearing. Although she knew she was walking on grass, her feet felt as though they were hitting hard, bare metal. Even her sense of smell was affected, she realized. The warm, fresh, clean air she'd been breathing a moment ago seemed to have been replaced by a dusty, acrid atmosphere. She was beginning to find the list of weapons bewildering. Before she'd read half of it, she'd forgotten what was at the top, and she didn't know what many of the words meant. "What's a light knife?" "It's an energy beam about as long as your forearm," Rees replied. "Great for close fighting. If someone has you in a clinch, think light knife and slip it between their ribs. It's high-powered though, so you run out of energy if you use it for more than a few seconds. That's one for emergencies." The idea of slipping anything between someone's ribs sounded horrific, even if it was only make-believe. She was beginning to regret her decision. She glanced at Rees, wondering how he would take it if she backed out, and jumped as she caught sight of him. In the game, he was wearing heavy armor, topped by a helmet shaped like a bird of prey. He turned and said, "What do you think? Cool, huh?" "Am I wearing something like that?" "You're wearing the default costume. I customized mine myself. Switch to overview and you'll see." She thought overview and immediately saw the factory from a high viewpoint. 2 figures were walking through it. One was Rees with his bird-like helmet, and the other was a woman wearing less heavy or stylized armor. She hardly recognized herself. Instead, she was reminded of Carina. Her heart felt heavy at the memory of her sister. She'd said she would come back, but that had been days ago. "Nearly there," Rees said. The game represented the trees of the grove on the Dirksen estate as pillars that rose from the factory floor to the vaulted ceiling. Where the ground was uneven, the game had made the floor broken and pitted. They reached the pillars and walked in among them. "Are you ready?" Rees asked. "Not really. I know some of the words, but I don't understand exactly what we're supposed to be doing." "That's easy. We fight each other." "That's all we have to do?" "Basically. If you die, you lose. Then we start again. Shall we make it the best out of 5? We can use the pillars as cover." What had given Rees the idea she would like the game, she had no clue. She had a feeling it was going to be over very quickly after she had been killed 5 times. Okay. We can start from the opposite ends of the grove and work our way in. What do you say?" All right then, I'll wait here. You go to the other side. Okay. Rhys set off through the pillars. She thought, arm rocket, and the weapon appeared on her wrist while its specks rose in her vision. Was it the right choice? She didn't know, but it was one of the few names she could understand. While she was trying to decide if she should pick something else, Rhys reappeared from between the pillars. She raised her arm rocket to fire at him, but he lifted his hands. "Don't shoot," he said, laughing. When he'd returned to her side, he continued, "You don't much like this game, do you?" "No, not really." He lifted his helmet and reached out to remove hers too. Suddenly she was back in the grounds of the Dirksen estate. The air felt fresh and earthy under the trees, and the dappled sunlight was warm. Rhys Dirksen was smiling down at her. "Sorry, I should have been more considerate. I thought you might like to fight. All my friends love it. But you aren't like that, are you?" "I guess not." She wanted to tell him how she'd been brought up to be ladylike, and that her father had despised the idea of any of his children doing anything as rough and uncouth as fighting. But revealing even that much about her past felt wrong. "Shall we take a walk through the trees then, as we're here?" Rhys asked. Without waiting for an answer, he took Parthenia's hand and set off. As she'd already denied him the chance to play his game, she thought it would be churlish to protest, so she went with him, dangling her visor in her other hand. "This is my favourite part of the estate," said Rhys. "When I was younger, if I wanted to hide from my mother, I would come here. I would sometimes spend hours up a tree, watching the servants searching for me." She smiled. Though his mother was holding her captive, she couldn't help herself from empathizing with him. Their upbringings had been similar. Belonging to a powerful clan brought privilege and comfort, extravagance in fact, but it had its downsides. "It's so hot," Rhys said. "Let's stop in the shade for a moment." She wondered at this proposal. The day wasn't particularly hot. Rhys led her under overhanging boughs to the hushed, shaded interior around a tree's thick trunk. "I wanted to tell you, Parthenia," said Rhys. "I'm so glad you came into my life. I like you a lot." She stiffened. How should she respond? If she rejected him outright, what might he or his mother do? "Well, I like you too," she said. She was about to qualify her statement, but Rhys was too fast. He swooped in for a kiss. She swerved out of the way. "What's wrong?" Rhys exclaimed. "You just said you liked me." "Not like that." "Why? Why not?" His fists were clenched and his face was turning red with anger. She didn't know what to say. Whatever she said, "Because your mother is holding me against my will and you think that's okay," was what sprang to mind, would only anger him further. She pushed through the branches and out into the grove. "Don't run away from me," Rhys shouted. "Come back here." She ran through the grove, dodging trees, heading toward the mansion. It felt strange to be heading to her prison as a place of refuge, but what else could she do? She was trapped. When would Carina come? Chapter 42. Carina lifted the giant main pincers of her mech and lowered them, testing them to their fullest extent. In response, a light appeared on her head-up display. Check. She turned in a circle, testing the maneuverability of the legs. Heavy thunks resounded, and her visual displayed 360 degrees of the rear part of the stadium, where the mechs and their tech teams waited for the battle to start. From her position, she couldn't see her opponent, but she could hear him or her going through the same checks. It was as she'd thought when she'd seen her first mech battle. The operators put the machines through thorough checks before entering the arena. The moves they went through in front of the crowd before engaging in the fight were only for show. This gave her an idea. If she acted on it, she would never be allowed to participate in another battle, but that didn't matter. She only needed to win this one. The black market arms dealer would be waiting for her after the show, ready with the weapons and everything else she needed, provided she had her prize money and winnings. Bryce had bet everything they'd earned over the previous days.
"Tammy,"
the mech manager's voice sounded over Carina's comm.
"All set? Everything okay?"
"Yeah, everything's working fine."
"I can see that. I'm asking about you."
"Oh, I'm good. Looking forward to it." The man, who went by his old stage name of the Stomper, had been nervous about giving her a chance, but excitement had overtaken his nerves as the betting on the battle mounted up. His ploy of selling her as a mysterious young newcomer had worked. Her masked image had been displayed on all the entertainment channels, and the manager had even scored an interview on a late-night show where he'd made up a bunch of nonsense to intrigue the audience. She'd caught a glimpse of the show before she'd turned it off in disgust. He'd told the interviewer it was a grudge match, that her family had once worked for Spear Corps, who were sponsoring the opposing team, but they'd all been laid off and were now on the streets.
"Man," the Stomper had said, "the Dark Avenger really hates Spear Corps. It makes her mad just to hear the name."
The audience most likely knew it was all untrue, but they didn't care. Believing in the fantasy was fun and a distraction from the slow crippling of their autonomy and freedom by the Dirksens. The resulting increased interest had worked in her favour. The stadium was sold out.
"Great," said the Stomper. "Try to last as long as you can out there. Give them a good show. If the fight's over in a couple of minutes, we'll get complaints."
She rolled her eyes. "Thanks for the vote of confidence."
"I'm just saying."
Ignoring him, she rechecked the mech's weapons. They were limited due to the safety factor. If a mech hurt an audience member, the company would receive more than complaints. Each of her main pincers converted to massive hammers, and huge spikes could spring out from the mech's knees. Short-range grapples fired from the machine's midriff in case she wanted to hold the other mech at close quarters and her pincers were gone. She figured in that scenario she could hit it with the mech's head. Her secondary pincers doubled as drills. She had to give the Stomper some credit. The mech she was fighting in was one of the least beat up he had to choose from, though the fact only emphasized his lack of faith in her. An ear-piercing jangle sounded. 1 minute to go. The noise of the crowd permeated even through her solid surroundings. Somewhere out there, Castiel was probably waiting. Would he try to transport her out from her mech the minute he saw her? It would be a difficult cast even for an experienced mage. She would barely be visible through the narrow slits in the control center, and Castiel would have to cast at some distance. Nevertheless, the possibility was her greatest danger. So, with great misgiving, she'd asked Bryce to bring the twins and Darius to the battle. Without their help, she would never be able to repulse Castiel's casts. She would be too busy fighting. Her siblings would have their work cut out for them tonight, and they would need to remain hidden from Castiel, though he would know they were here somewhere.
"You're on in 10, the Stomper said. "Good luck, Tammy."
"Thanks." She gripped the controls and focused. She had only one goal: win 5 fights. She had to trust her siblings to do their work, or she would find herself back on the Dirksen estate and Parthenia would remain captive. The gigantic doors in front of her split down the middle and swung inward. A roar went up. Her display blinked and darkened in response to the brilliant light shining from the pit. Across the stadium, she could see another set of doors opening and her opponent standing in shadow, light reflecting softly from dull metal. The other mech took a step, beginning its walk into the stadium. She waited.
"Go in now," said the Stomper.
She didn't reply.
"Move, Tammy."
The other mech was inside the pit and was beginning its performance of pretending to check its systems.
"Tammy!"
the Stomper yelled.
"What the hell are you waiting for? Get in there!"
Watching the mech, she waited a little longer. The noise of the crowd was rapidly fading, degenerating to confused babbles. The Stomper shouted, "If you don't move now, so help me I'll—" She ran through the doors. Ran was a strong word to describe the lumbering gait of the giant mech from a standing start, but she pushed the machine to its extreme speed. She had only one chance and she had to get it right. The other mech didn't even notice her coming. She slammed into it, knocking it off its feet and into the doors, which had only just closed. The mech bounced against the wall, splintering the rock-hard surface, and slid to the ground. The crowd went crazy. Disregarding the ear-splitting howls and whoops, she let her momentum carry her over to the prone mech. The Stomper was bellowing something, but she ignored him too. After raising her pincers and simultaneously turning them into hammers, she brought them down with maximum force on the hip junctions of the opposing mech. They were the toughest parts, but she had the perfect shot. If she damaged them, the mech wouldn't be able to move and the fight would be over. But her opponent wasn't going to give up so easily. Projectiles on thick metal ropes shot out and pierced her mech's midriff. The pointed end of one protruded into her cab. A damage report appeared in her display. She sent her secondary pincers to sever the ropes while she struck again at her opponent's hips. Her plan seemed to be working. The mech was trying to stand, but its legs were moving oddly. The secondary pincers couldn't cut the ropes. They couldn't even make a dent. It didn't matter. She brought her hammers down for a third time. The shock of the impact jolted her. She also registered a blow to her legs. The other mech was attacking her with its pincers. She was convinced the third impact on the mech's hips had done the job. She backed up to move out of reach. She needed her mech to last her through 4 more battles. The ropes that attached her to the other mech held fast, however, and she found herself dragging it across the floor of the pit. Her mech's systems complained about the additional weight. Another blow struck her legs. She didn't know what to do. She had no way to cut the ropes, but if she didn't move out of range of the other mech, hers would soon suffer a lot of damage. Why hadn't they called the fight? Her opponent was incapacitated. She'd clearly won. She backed up some more. This time the tension on the ropes tore them from their mooring on the opposing mech. The sudden release caused her to overbalance. Her machine tumbled down. The horn sounded. The fight was finally called. 4 more to go. Chapter 43. Parthenia hated the noise of the crowd, and she wasn't remotely interested in mech battles. 2 giant machines fighting each other wasn't a spectacle she relished. A sharp, pulsing headache was irritating her, but other than that, she was utterly bored. Castiel seemed to be finding something about her amusing. Every time he snuck a sidelong glance at her, he smirked. Her brother's enjoyment of her misery wasn't a new phenomenon by any means, but Parthenia suspected there was something else underlying his amusement. She refused to gratify him further by asking what he found funny, however, so she resigned herself to remaining in the dark. He probably had a nasty plan to execute later on. She only hoped it wasn't going to be aimed at poor Nala, who had suffered from his spite several times over the past few days. Castiel insisted on using her as a subject on which to practice his casting skills. He enthralled her to do stupid, embarrassing, and even dangerous things. When he'd made her walk around the entire estate naked so that every servant, guard, and gardener saw her, even Langley had been appalled and asked him to stop. This had resulted in a standoff of a kind. Langley saw herself as the head of the household, with the final say on everything that happened beneath her roof. It wasn't an unreasonable claim, or at least to everyone except Castiel. Langley had gently admonished him and suggested that, if he had to use a living person for his experiments, to choose one of the servants and not his own sister. Castiel had been furious, though she suspected she was the only one who truly understood the depths of his anger. He had mastered himself. He had walked away, not responding to Langley at all. But Parthenia wondered what would happen the next time the two clashed. Langley Dirksens seemed to think that casting was similar to performing magic tricks. She didn't understand what an immoral mage could do. She had no idea, for example, of the split cast that had killed father. Parthenia wondered if she should warn Langley, but she doubted the woman would listen. She would only think she was trying to undermine Castiel in the hope that she might cast and escape. And Rhys hadn't spoken to her since she'd rejected him in the grove, which was a good thing. He'd shown his true colours when he was angry that she wouldn't kiss him. Parthenia realised he'd been manipulating her all along. It would be extremely convenient for the Dirksens to have a mage in the family. From the corner of her eye, she noticed Castiel sip from a bottle. He was casting, and as far as she knew, it was for the third or fourth time this evening. But why? She scanned the stadium. She couldn't see anything her brother might want to influence, unless he was only trying to affect the outcome of the battle. That was possible. Langley was betting furiously. A roar went up so loud Parthenia winced and covered her ears. Her head felt like it was going to burst. She wished she could have just a sip of elixir to cast heal on herself, but Castiel would never allow it. He would think she wanted it to transport herself far away, which of course she would. The battle below was over. The winning mech was leaving the pit and techs were entering from the other side to remove the loser. The crowd was quietening as people began to leave their seats and move around during the interval. "Well, well, well," Castiel said. "Our half-sister's quite the fighter, isn't she?" Through the pounding of her head, Parthenia took a moment to register what her brother had said. Even then, she didn't guess right away what he was referring to. "What do you mean?" "Carina, you idiot," Castiel sneered. "How dumb are you? I can't believe you haven't noticed her image displayed all over the stadium. She just won that battle." Her mouth fell open as she gazed up at the figure of a woman wearing a mask flashing on the display board. It was Carina. How had she missed it? "Of course," Castiel continued. "She's a pretty good mage too, though not as good as me. When she's under my control, I'll be sure to make use of all her talents." Parthenia shot a look at her brother. Did his statement mean what it seemed to imply? Castiel's expression was neutral and far-gazing, lost in dreams of power and control. Parthenia imagined what would be the outcome if her brother tried to force himself on Carina. If he were lucky, he might leave the encounter intact. She sniggered. Castiel heard. He spun to face her. "What's so funny?" he demanded.
You think you can get away with laughing at me? I'll...
Langley placed a hand gently on his shoulder. She was sitting behind him.
It wouldn't be wise to do anything rash in front of all these people, Castiel. Please consider the Dirksen reputation.
He shrugged her off and scowled. He leaned close to Parthenia and spoke into her ear.
That bitch might think she has a hold over me, but I'm only tolerating her until I find my feet. I'm going to rule the Dirksen clan, and after I've crushed the Shurers into dust, I'm going to rule this entire sector. People complain about the two clans, but they don't know the meaning of suffering. They won't know what's hit them when I'm in charge. They'll look back on these days like they were paradise. So you'd better watch out, Parthenia. You'd better not laugh at me again. I won't forget it. I'll make you pay, and there won't be anyone who can stop me.
Castiel's words chilled her. Though she knew what her brother was capable of, hearing him state his intentions out loud was horrifying. And he could do it, she realized. He could do everything he wanted to because he was a mage. The second battle was about to start. The doors the mechs entered through were opening. Castiel took a swig of elixir. She gasped. That was what he was doing. He was trying to transport Carina out of her mech. Castiel closed his eyes. She wanted to do something, but what? If she knocked him to distract him, he would only ask Harmon to take her outside. She would have lost her chance. She had to do something effective and long-lasting. As she dithered, Castiel must have made his cast, for he opened his eyes and muttered something that she couldn't hear over the noise of the crowd. The mechs below had entered into battle. He stood up and searched the stadium with his gaze. Then he turned and spoke to Langley. Her eyebrows lifted in response to his comment. She beckoned Harmon and told him the news, and he in turn spoke into his comm. Though she loathed speaking to Castiel, Parthenia had a feeling that whatever it was he had realized, it was pertinent information. She shouted over the crowd, "What is it, Castiel? Has Carina left?" "Ha! No! You guessed I was trying to transport her? Well, you'll be delighted to hear our dear siblings are here somewhere. They've stupidly revealed themselves by attempting to repulse my casts. I thought I noticed something odd going on earlier. Now I'm convinced of it. So it looks as though I have all my little birds in one trap. Very convenient." He gave her a ghoulish smile. She turned from him in disgust. She hated the thought of being related to him. More than that, she hated how powerless she felt. She couldn't bear the thought of all her brothers and sisters being under his control, and his plans for the future sounded monstrous. But what could she do? She was just one person, and she couldn't even fight. Below her, the mechs were battling hard. Carina seemed to be winning, but Parthenia found it hard to tell. She wondered why her sister had decided to take part. It was very strange, especially since it had led to Castiel discovering her. And now it looked like the Dirksen thugs were roaming the crowds, looking for their siblings too. If Castiel succeeded in capturing their remaining family, they would be back to a life of servitude, possibly a worse one than they'd endured under father. Their mother had been there to protect them to an extent, but Castiel had no one to moderate his behaviour. Parthenia watched Carina fight, wishing she was as strong and brave as her sister. Castiel sipped from his elixir again and closed his eyes. He was entirely unafraid of her, she realized. He was comfortably certain she would sit next to him passively and do nothing to stop him. A mighty crash resounded below as the mechs collided. Then another crash sounded, though this one was more like thunder, and it came from outside the stadium. After a short, confused pause, the crowd returned to their shouts and chanting. Parthenia's heart was racing. The scenario of the future that was playing out in her mind terrified her. She couldn't let it happen. She just couldn't. Even if she didn't manage to save herself, she had to do something to save her brothers and sisters. She had to make a gesture, no matter how insignificant. A deafening boom sounded and echoed through the stadium. The crowd grew quieter as they tried to understand what was happening. Castiel was also puzzled. He peered around, his bottle of elixir in his hand. She took her chance. She grabbed it. Castiel registered a moment of shock before trying to snatch it back. He was too late. She threw the bottle down so hard it smashed. The elixir soaked into the floor. Castiel looked up at her, white with rage. She didn't care. She had made her gesture. Now what else could she do? Chapter 44. The third battle of the evening was turning out to be Carina's hardest yet. It wasn't surprising. Her mech had taken considerable damage. The techs had done their best to patch up the machine over the interval, but nearly half the display wasn't lit, and neither of her secondary pincers were working. Also, the first mech she had faced had pummeled one of her legs so much it didn't function properly and was slowing her down. For close quarters fighting, that didn't matter too much. It wasn't like she could run away from her opponent, but Carina needed as much of her mech as possible to be working if she were to survive to the final round. One thing to be thankful for was that her mage siblings were doing a good job of deflecting Castiel's casts. Though she could hardly see any of the crowd, Carina knew her brother had to be here. She hoped her brothers and sisters would be able to keep up their efforts all night, and that Langley's thugs wouldn't find them. Bryce had assured her they would be hard to discover in the packed stadium, but that didn't stop her from worrying. A pincer grabbed her mech's head. Damn! She'd allowed herself to become distracted. Carina turned on the spot, twisting out of the grip, though the scraping and rending noises this caused were painful to her ears. Her remaining systems were still intact, so the damage was probably surface only. When fighting, it paid to vary your technique. Her current opponent would have watched her previous battles in order to attempt to predict what she might do. Carina had already used up her one chance at surprising the opposition by foregoing custom and launching straight into an attack, a move the Stomper had severely admonished her for. He'd said she'd nearly forfeited the match, except the officials couldn't find anything in the rulebook to say she couldn't do it. In her second battle, she'd bypassed obvious moves again. She hadn't even attempted to hit her opponent. Instead, she'd run straight at him, chest to chest, grappled him, and drilled into his knees with her transformed secondary pincers. That had been what had ruined the pincers, though it had won her the fight. This time she needed something new. While she was thinking, she smashed into her opponent. At the same time, a crash sounded outside that hadn't come from the collision. She was puzzled. She'd thought she'd heard loud noises in her previous fight, and they had to be exceptionally loud for her to hear them over everything else. She'd thought a massive thunderstorm was on its way, but the latest sound hadn't been thunder. A bang exploded above her. Carina felt the shockwave in her bones. Her head-up display flashed and disappeared. Her mech had received a colossal blow to the head. The system might reboot and kick in again, but for now she was working blind. In one way it was frustrating, in another it was liberating. She had learned the ropes of hand-to-hand fighting long ago. With her computer system out, her mech was just an extension of her. She peered through the slit and spotted the looming shadow of her opponent, who was gearing up for another strike. She spun away on her good leg, turned 360 degrees and flailed both her main pincers into her opponent's side. The other mech had missed her entirely when she moved and was raising itself again. The concussion vibrated through her cabin, but she hadn't managed to hit hard enough to knock down her opponent. She would have to resort to a tactic she'd been hoping to save for the final battle. It was a desperate measure that would result in more damage to her mech, but she couldn't think of anything else. She activated the circular saw in her mech's head. At least she hoped she activated it, because her display wasn't telling her. Then she heard a satisfying buzz over the screams of the crowd. The onlookers clearly knew what she intended and loved the spectacle. Carina drove into her opponent. She wouldn't be able to get a good swing at him this way, but she hoped to soar into his mech and mess up his system so badly he couldn't operate. The opposing mech controller had two options: try to get away or also activate his saw. The noise of buzzing and grinding redoubled. Her opponent had chosen the latter option, which was bad news, but hopefully worse news for the other mech. She had a few seconds head start. Now it was just a waiting game. She tried to pummel him as well, despite the constraints of the confined space. A whistling sound pierced the air, quickly followed by the roar of an explosion. The excited screams of the crowd turned to shrieks of horror. Carina leaned forward to see out of the narrow view hole, but all that was visible was the blank metal of the other mech. What was going on? The last thing she'd heard had sounded like, "We're being attacked!" It was the other mech operator shouting at her. Of course, that was the source of the other explosions. The Shurers had launched their takeover of Ostalon. A crackling fizz filled the stadium and light flared into her cabin. Wails and shouts were coming from the crowd. She could imagine the panic and rush to leave. She hoped Bryce and the kids weren't hurt and Bryce could get them all out safely. But what should she do? Her saw was still operating and her opponent was yelling for her to turn it off. She tried, but the saw didn't respond. "I can't," she called out. "My system's down. Nothing's working." The other mech moved away. Without the counter pressure, her mech began to fall. She hit the ground face down and dangled in her safety straps. The saw in her mech's head continued to grind away. She couldn't see a thing. All her viewing slits were coated in the dust her saw was throwing up in showers. The sounds from outside were a jumble of panicked voices punctuated by the bombardment of the Shurer forces. The techs who were responsible for her machine would be running for their lives. She was on her own. She unfastened her straps one by one, gradually lowering herself to the front of her chamber, which was now the floor. She crawled up the side to the door and punched the exit button. Predictably, the door remained closed. It would run on the same system as the rest of the mech. If she'd been trapped in there after a fight, the techs would have their own way of opening it. Now she didn't know how she was going to get out. Carina began to search around in the near darkness. There had to be a manual release mechanism somewhere. The Stomper hadn't bothered to show her what to do in an emergency, but it didn't make any sense to leave the operator with no way of getting out by themselves. Her fingers probed the bumpy surfaces. As she searched, the realization hit that her entire plan had fallen apart. She wouldn't win her prize or her bets, and the arms dealer wouldn't be waiting for her with the stuff she needed. Parthenia would remain trapped on the Dirksen estate, only now she would be moved somewhere else, perhaps to another planet as the Dirksens fled Ostalon. Damn it! Her heart ached for her sister. She couldn't bear the thought of her being held captive by Castiel, a clone of his father. With an entire galactic sector to search, how would she ever find her? Chapter 45. The stadium was in utter chaos. Parthenia had guessed her father's clan was attacking Ostalon. She was trying to fight against the flow of the crowd, but it was hopeless. Then she noticed the seating was nearly empty. Everyone was crowding into the aisles. She edged along a row and began climbing over the seats. She had to reach Carina. Her sister's mech was down and disabled, and she was sure she hadn't seen her sister emerge from it. As she reached for a seat, her hand twinged with pain. She rubbed her knuckles, smiled, and continued on. All around her the people surged and pushed, heading in the opposite direction. Another hissing, crackling projectile arrived, impacting close by the stadium. Whoever was attacking, they were intent on destroying the city. She had to help Carina out and get her away. The stadium had already received a glancing blow, destroying part of an outer wall. It was only a matter of time before the place would be razed to rubble. Parthenia wished she could shout to her sister to reassure her that someone was coming, but she would never be heard over the noise. There was also the chance that one of Langley's guards might notice her and recapture her. She hoped they would be fleeing the stadium too, or helping Langley and Rhys to safety. Perhaps they were carrying Castiel out with them. She smiled again. She had reached the lowest tier of seating at the very edge of the pit. Now she was here, however, she couldn't see any way down. The drop was too deep to jump. If she had elixir, she could transport in, but she had none. She ran around the edge. It was deserted except for jumbles of coats and other belongings left by the fleeing spectators. There had to be a way into the pit. Why couldn't she find it? She noticed a dark, empty exit between the seats. Seeing no other option, she ran through and down the stairs at the end of the passage. The noises from outside grew fainter as she descended, following each turn of the stairs and ignoring the doors at each landing. The air became cool and moist. She was definitely heading into the depths of the stadium. Finally, the stairs came to an end. She pushed open a set of double doors. She had reached the pit. Up close, the two mechs looked even more enormous than they had from above. The center of the standing one was open, its operator gone. The prone mech, Carina's, was still working. The saw in its head was gouging a deep trough in the sand and throwing up a cloud of dust. She ran over to Carina's mech. She could barely make head or tail of the thing, but she guessed Carina had to be somewhere in its center. The dust was choking her. She lifted her shirt over her nose and squinted to keep it out of her eyes. When she arrived at the belly of the mech, she banged on its side. "Carina, can you hear me?" Her fist striking the metal made no sound, or at least nothing she could hear over the whine of the saw, the still noisy crowd, and the regular explosions of air-to-ground fire. "Carina!" she shouted at the top of her voice before subsiding into a fit of coughing. Surely there had to be a way to see inside the mech. She wiped dust from her face and stepped closer to the spinning saw. A ridge ran up the side of the machine where a bank of dust had built up. She pulled her sleeve over her hand and wiped the ridge clean. It was the edge of a narrow slit. She peered through it, but she could see only darkness. She put her mouth to the slit. "Carina, are you in there?" Then she turned her head and placed her ear against the gap. Did she hear an answer? She thought so. She moved her head to call inside again, but she saw a pair of eyes looking out at her. "Carina!" she cried in happiness. 4 fingers poked through the slit. Parthenia grabbed them. "How can I get you out?" Her sister's reply was faint. "I don't know. Can you see anything? Like a manual override?" She couldn't even see the exit to the machine, let alone the mechanism to open it. She asked her sister where she should be looking. When she'd finally found the spot and cleared away the dust to search the area, she still couldn't find anything to open the hatch. She returned to the slit to tell Carina the bad news. As she was walking around the giant machine, part of the stadium exploded. Debris began to rain down. Her ears were ringing. She put her arms over her head for protection and continued to return to Carina. She called to her sister through the gap. The 4 fingers reappeared and she grasped them. "I couldn't find it," she yelled, though her voice sounded faint. "I don't know how to get you out." If Carina replied, she didn't hear her. She held on to her sister's fingers and sank down to the ground. She wanted so much to help her, but she didn't know what else to do. She couldn't get inside the machine or move it. The stadium was being steadily demolished and Carina was trapped. How could she save her sister? As she held Carina's fingers, she rubbed away the tears that were mixing with dust on her face. She had finally stood up for herself when she'd gotten away from Castiel, but it wasn't enough. It didn't matter how brave she was if she couldn't help the people she loved. Parthenia had resigned herself to staying with Carina no matter what happened. She couldn't leave her sister here to die trapped inside an ugly mechanical monster. When they'd been together on nightfall, it would have been much easier for Carina to escape if she'd been alone, but she'd risked her life to take all her family with her, even Castiel, though he didn't appreciate it. She could never abandon her now. Another explosion resounded. As she looked up to see what part of the stadium had been hit, she saw figures running out to her from one of the entrances to the pit. She cringed. So Langley had left behind some guards to find her. Parthenia had thought they must have all left. But then she noticed through the dust and gloom that 3 of the figures were shorter than they should be. One of them was very short. Her heart nearly burst with joy. "Darius!" She leapt up and ran to the little boy, scooping him into her arms. Oriana and Fern grabbed her, jumping up and down with happiness. "Wait," Darius said, struggling. "I have to get Carina out." "Can you?" she asked as she put him down. "Have you got some elixir?" The 4th figure walked up. She was shocked to see Carina's friend, Bryce. "We've got some left, but not a lot," he said, handing a bottle to Darius. "Do your work, kid." Clutching the bottle in his little hand, Darius ran over to the mech. He reached up to Carina's fingers. In another moment, her sister was out of the machine and standing next to him. As the 2 embraced, Parthenia burst into tears again. "I can't believe it! We finally did it! We're finally together again!" As she spoke, however, she realized that wasn't exactly true. "Come on!" Carina shouted as she began to run. Everyone sprinted with her to one of the sets of massive mech entrance doors. One of the doors remained ajar, and they slipped through it to the backstage area. The noise of the bombing faded somewhat. Carina led them through the workshop areas and offices until they emerged from the building into the parking lot. The vehicles that remained were wrecked, and in places the ground was cratered. "We need to transport somewhere," said Carina, "but I don't know where we'll be safe from the Shura attack." They jogged across the lot while they thought about what they should do. "You should thank Darius," Bryce said to Parthenia. "All the time you were in the pit, Dirksen guards were spotting you and coming in to get you. Darius transported them away." "His casts are so powerful," Oriana broke in. "He's been moving them to the other side of the planet so they couldn't quickly return in a hover vehicle." "He must have transported about 30 of them," Fern exclaimed. "I was worried that Castiel would cast you out of there when the bombardment started," Bryce said. She laughed. "Well, he wouldn't have been able to for a while. I knocked him out." "You did what?" Bryce asked. I broke his elixir bottle and then I punched him, like this." She made a fist and swung forcefully into the air. "I really hurt my hand, but I don't care. It was fantastic. His eyes rolled back and he keeled over. He was out cold. And then, when I looked around, the bodyguard, Harmon, was gone, and everyone was distracted by the bombing. So I jumped over the edge of the box and into the crowd below." "But what about when Castiel comes around?" Oriana asked. "Won't he be able to locate you? He must have something you were in contact with." "I don't think so. I made a point of washing everything I wore or used every night, and I was careful to always clean out my hairbrush. He might think he has something he can use, but he doesn't." "I know," said Carina, spinning around. "We should go into the forest. The Shurras won't bother attacking that. They'll target inhabited areas and tactical sites." "But wait," said Parthenia. "We're forgetting about Nala. We have to get her, Carina. We can't leave her there with that monster." "You mean go back to Langley Dirksens' estate?" Carina looked troubled. "I feel sorry for Nala too, but do you really think she wants to leave Castiel? She seems to adore him." "Not any more. Not since he learned to cast. He's been behaving terribly toward her. It reminds me of how Father used to treat Mother. I'm sure she hates him now. She's just too frightened to show it. We have to help her. Even if she isn't a mage, she's still one of us." "Parthenia," Carina said sadly. "I hear you, but it's too dangerous for any of us to go there. We would have to search to find her, and someone would be sure to spot us." "Not if we know exactly where she is," said Parthenia. She pulled out a handkerchief. "It's hers. She was using it the other day when she had a cold." "Oh, Carina wrinkled her nose and took the handkerchief, pinching it between her thumb and forefinger. "Okay, that could work. Let's transport to the forest first." Chapter 46. Carina appeared in a dark room. All she could hear was the sound of someone breathing, deeply and regularly, as if asleep. As her eyes became accustomed to the darkness, she realized with relief she was in the right place. She also realized that Castiel was an idiot. No one else was here except little Nala, fast asleep in bed. Her brother hadn't imagined anyone would bother to take her from him. He probably thought everyone else held her in the same low regard as he did. Langley's mansion didn't seem to have been attacked by the Shurras yet, which was odd. If her suspicion that the woman she'd spotted was one of their spies, the Shurras definitely knew exactly where the estate was, and that a high-ranking Dirksen lived here. Well, it wasn't a puzzle she needed to figure out. She hoped to leave the Shurra-Dirksen struggle for power behind as soon as she could. The elixir was down to its last dregs. After she'd transported Nala and herself out, they would only have a little left. They would have to find a way to make some more, which might be challenging in a burnt forest. Never mind. Saving the little girl was absolutely worth it. In 2 steps she was beside her bed. Kneeling down, she took Nala's hand where it lay on the blanket, then swallowed some elixir. She cast. They appeared in the forest. Nala's eyes opened, and she sat bolt upright in surprise. "Yay! Carina's back!" Darius yelled. "She's got Nala!" The children ran over to their sister and started making a fuss of her. They began to explain to the shocked girl where she was and what had happened. "Wait," Carina said. "We have to check Nala and Parthenia for tracers. Darius, here's the last of the elixir. I'm pretty sure you'll be able to sense them if they're there. Do you want to do it?" Her brother took the bottle and set to work. After checking both his sisters for the devices, he declared confidently that he had found them. In a matter of moments, he had also removed them without causing any harm. Fern set off to scatter the tracers over a wide area before the family moved on. Relieved they were finally free of the Dirksens, Carina walked over to Bryce where he was leaning against the burned remains of a tree. He hugged her and wrapped his arms around her waist. She rested her head on his chest. She was exhausted. 3 mech fights had tired her out, and the emotional turmoil of the night's events had also drained her.
"It's strange how things turn out, isn't it?" Bryce said. "This wasn't the plan, but you ended up getting Parthenia back anyway. And now you have another member of your family with you."
"Yeah, I hope Parthenia's right about Nala no longer having any loyalty to Castiel. If she has, she could easily betray us."
"I don't think she will. She's just a little girl."
"Darius is just a little boy, yet he saved me and Parthenia tonight, according to what you say."
"He did. He was amazing."
Carina watched her youngest brother chatting with Nala, his head of thick tousled hair bobbing around and his arms making expansive gestures. So much mage power in such a little body. She wondered what he would be capable of when he grew up.
"So what now?" Bryce asked.
"We have to find a way to go off-planet. If the Shura's attack is successful and they find Castiel, they'll be looking for us too. I want to get everyone as far from both the clans as I can." She was about to tell Bryce about her desire to find Earth when Parthenia walked up to them. "Thank you for rescuing Nala. You won't regret it. She's so happy to be away from him." "I'm glad she's away from him too," Carina said. "I hope she recovers from his maltreatment." "I think she will," said Parthenia. "We are all better since leaving the Shuras, even though things have been hard. But I wanted to ask you, what are we going to do now?"
"I was wondering the same," said Bryce.
"Because we have to do something to stop Castiel." Carina made a noise of disgust. "Is he really any of our business any longer? Let the Dirksens have him, or the Shuras, or whoever else wants him. But no one else can stop him but us. You should have heard what he was telling me tonight. He plans on taking over the Dirksens, and then the Shuras, and then whoever else may stand in his way until the entire sector is under his control. Can you imagine how things would be if a mage like Castiel were in charge?" Carina wanted to disagree with her sister. She wanted nothing more to do with Castiel, but she knew exactly what Parthenia meant, and she knew her sister was right. A heaviness settled over her heart as she realized her work was not over. She couldn't take her sisters and brothers and escape to somewhere safe. She would have to find a way to defeat the son of an evil father. "Okay," she said, "I get it. We have to do something, but I don't know what. The truth is, I don't know what I'm dealing with in Castiel. I don't know why his mage abilities developed so late. The same as I don't know why Darius picks up on everyone's emotions and can throw 30 grown men and women halfway around a planet without breaking a sweat." "But I thought you knew all about mages," Parthenia said. "Not at all. My grandmother died when I was quite young. Though she might have told me a lot, I must have forgotten half of it. I don't even know how Ma and Dad managed to meet when mages are so isolated and secretive." "Oh, I know that. Mother told me she'd been married before and that she'd met her first husband at a festival, somewhere. I can't remember right now, but it'll come back to me if I think about it. She swore me to secrecy, of course, so Father wouldn't find out what I knew." "Really?" said Carina. It was a lead, if only a small one.
"Weren't you saying there was some information about mages in that religion's holy book?"
"Yes, though I had to read between the lines."
"Well, that's a start, isn't it?"
"I guess so." Parthenia returned to the group of children who were laughing and chatting as if they hadn't a care in the world. It was hard to believe what they'd each endured recently. If the boys and girls had been at home or in a park, no one could have guessed the trials they had been subjected to over the previous days. Yet they were under the stars in the remains of a forest fire. the sky flashing and booms pulsing from the Shura bombardment in the distance. They had no food or water or anywhere to sleep, and they had a challenging time ahead, striving to prevent their malevolent brother from achieving his bid for ultimate power. Carina hoped with all her heart that whatever happened, her little family would come out the other side unscathed. The end. This has been Dark Mage Rises, Mage Saga Book 2, written and narrated by J.J. Green. The next book in the Mage Saga series is Wildfire and Steel, Mage Saga Book 3. For more J.J. Green books, visit jjgreenauthor.com.